Brilliance Audio.
When She Left by E.A. Aymar, performed by Janine Granda. Part 1. And it came to pass when they had brought them forth abroad that he said, Escape for thy life. Look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. Genesis chapter 19, verse 17. Chapter 1. Melissa. Melissa Cruz realized she was trapped the moment those two men sauntered into the 24-hour diner. "They found us," she whispered to Jake Smith. Hope had finally begun to seem like a possibility, and now it was over, the abrupt ending of an interrupted prayer. Her fists tightened helplessly in her lap. Breath was hard to come by. Jake sat across from her, his back to the door, oblivious. He didn't look up from his camera as he spoke. Who? What? Melissa brought her hand to her forehead to hide her face, hoped the movement wasn't obvious. "The people hunting us," she said, low and intense. It was difficult for her to say the whole sentence, fear nearly turning it into a question. "Hunting us?" Jake swung around. "Jake!" Melissa whispered desperately. He ignored her, kept looking at the two men who had entered the diner, stared as they sat at a booth near the door. "Turn around!" Melissa's high hiss broke through and Jake turned. The bruises coloring the left side of his face, a faded map, were already less apparent than they had been yesterday. But Melissa still noticed them. And despite her fear, they still caused her heart to ache. Love and guilt wrestling inside her like a pair of angels tumbling to earth. "That's not them," Jake announced. Melissa wanted to believe him, wanted to let that wave of relief wash over her. "How do you know?" He shrugged, unconcerned. "They don't seem the type. Polos, slacks, one of them has a lanyard. Probably here for some kind of convention. Came to get food after a party." Men always had this sense of certainty, of working in absolutes, the world defined by their perspective. "Nothing's wrong. We're fine. I thought so." Sometimes Melissa found this confidence comforting, even if she knew it was misplaced. She peered again at the two men. Or they're trying not to look suspicious. Jake grinned, that easy smile that always softened everything inside her. "Honestly, if the Winteresses made custom polos to find us at midnight in some random diner, then they deserve to catch us." He lifted his camera and snapped a pair of pictures of the half-eaten food on their table. The soft apple pie and finished dinner, an empty coffee cup in front of him, the cooling bowl of tomato soup and nibbled grilled cheese sandwich in front of her. He reached across the table with his free hand. "No one's after us," Jake insisted. Her hand was cold in his. Melissa had accidentally left her jacket in the car and the diner wasn't warm. She could feel the chill coming in from outside, from the thin glass window alongside their booth. No one just leaves them, especially the way we did. Melissa had heard stories about men and women who'd tried to leave the Winters crime family, how they'd been caught, the parts of them that had been found. "And you need to be more careful," Melissa went on. She disliked the bossiness in her voice, but couldn't help it. "You can't just stare at someone when I tell you they might be watching us." "I do that?" "You just did." "Must be a guy thing," Jake mused. "I think it's a you thing." Jake looked like he was going to say something else, but caught himself. He returned to his pie. Melissa watched him, her mind split with worry about their current situation and self-exasperation at how brusque she was being with him. "The Winteresses have every cop in the area looking into them," Jake said between bites. "The last thing anyone in that family can do is follow us. It was a perfect time to leave." "There's never a perfect time to run off with another man." Jake nibbled from the piece of pie and abruptly pushed the bowl next to a plate of chicken fried steak he'd turned into crumbs. "That's a really good point," he admitted. Chris Winters was going to find them, and Melissa knew, intimately, the impact of her ex-boyfriend's anger. She could almost feel it, a rope binding her to him, the two of them forever connected. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "I don't," she said honestly. "I just wish I wasn't so scared." Talking with Jake helped, reminded Melissa why she was running off with him. "And I don't feel comfortable in public," she continued. "I feel like I should be looking everywhere and my shoulders are tight and I keep having to pee, although maybe that's all the water." "No one at some diner at midnight is going to remember us," Jake interrupted. "All they'll be able to say is we were some random white guy and a hot Spanish chick." "Panamanian," Melissa corrected him. "See? That easy grin. I'm saying." And again, Melissa remembered how that grin used to relax her, its offhand assurance. It didn't work now. When she'd imagined running off with Jake, love had been their North Star, rightfully guiding every decision, their devoted accomplice. And she still did love Jake. Melissa looked at him and it was like sunrise in her chest, but she hadn't realized how much her fear would weigh. Melissa wondered where the waitress was. She hadn't seen her since their food was brought out. The only customers were her and Jake, a middle-aged couple in the back, and the two men quietly talking in the booth near the entrance. And it was likely to stay that way. This remote diner, somewhere outside Frederick, Maryland, didn't seem like it would draw a crowd, much less on a cold, late December night. That was why she and Jake had picked it, the first time they'd left his old Honda Accord in the safety of its enclosure, the opportunity to speed away from danger. "Those men in the front," Melissa said slowly, thinking as she was speaking, "with the lanyards. No one helped them." "What do you mean?" "They just walked in and sat down and they haven't ordered anything. They haven't even looked for the waitress." Jake was back to examining his camera. "People do that." "No one comes to a diner at midnight just to sit and talk without ordering anything. No one—" A door opened with a sudden whisk, like a ghost was gliding by. The waitress emerged from the kitchen, headed over to the two men in front. Melissa let out a shaky breath. "Maybe I do need a chill. Maybe." Jake snapped another quick picture of her, frowned at the display on his digital camera. Melissa had grown used to the constant presence of his camera. "Just don't pay attention to it," Jake had told her when they'd first met, and that seemed impossible at first. Impossible to ignore the way he needed everything documented and memorialized, and then intensely scrutinized. Often reshot. Jake's hopeless annoyance when he didn't get the exact picture he wanted, his contagious cheerfulness when he did. "You really think we're going to be okay?" Melissa couldn't help the skepticism in her voice. "It's not like we stole money from them or anything," he offered. "And Chris took his anger out on me already." Jake touched his cheek, his fingers grazing the bruises. "I know." Her voice small and childlike, far younger than her 23 years. Melissa had seen violence before, horrible images that tugged at her like lecherous hands. She carried them with her, memories like a small frantic germ determined to infect. But she felt dizzy when she thought about Chris's fists slamming into Jake's cheek, That weird, happy light that almost seemed to illuminate Chris's face as he knelt over Jake's body. The anguish and the anger she'd felt for Jake. She remembered the wine bottle in her hand, the thick glass as she stood behind Chris and raised it high. Melissa? She was bombarded by memories, unbalanced between two different worlds, not fully present in either. Vertigo climbed her body like hungry spiders. I'll be back. Melissa slid out of the booth and headed to the restroom. Pushed open the door for the women's room, made her way to the sink. She pressed her palms down on the cold counter, closed her eyes, and breathed slowly, deeply, the kind of hypnotic breathing the counselor she'd once briefly seen had recommended. Deep from the diaphragm. Hold it for 5 seconds. Exhale slowly like a quiet stream in a wooded area. Imagine sunlight through shadows. 3 slow breaths. Melissa opened her eyes, walked into one of the stalls, covered the seat with toilet paper, slid her pants and underwear to her knees. Unhappily leaned forward, elbows pressed into her thighs. She pulled her phone out of her purse and checked her messages. She'd texted her friend Carla Acosta hours ago, asking if she'd heard anything from Chris or the Winterises, and Carla kept telling her no. Ellos tienen otras cosas preocupado. But Melissa didn't buy that Chris or the Winterises would be focused on anything else. She thought about contacting Carla again, but decided against it. Knew it couldn't calm her fear and uncertainty. Or that other thing, that tiny feeling darting inside her like a pesky gnat. Guilt. Melissa felt sorry for Chris, despite how viciously he'd hurt Jake. A 4-year relationship was a lot to leave, even if that last year had been spent arguing, so often on opposite sides that a breakup seemed inevitable. At least it had to her. She'd been able to hide her guilt from herself, smother it in justification and Xanax. Those mornings when she'd leave Jake's apartment, the summer sun emerging hotly, like snarling honesty forcing her to confront what she'd done with Jake the night before. That was when Melissa had told herself that she was going to end it soon. That this wasn't the kind of thing she'd ever do when she was eventually married. Of course, she'd suspected Chris of doing the same, even if she had no proof. But the idea of blaming Chris made her feel better. All the justifications, desperate to appease herself, those hot mornings after sweltering evenings. Now there was no hiding who she was or what she had done. Melissa flushed, left the stall. She glanced at herself in the bathroom mirror as she soaped her hands. Pulled a wrinkled brown paper towel from a dispenser, dried off, dropped it on top of an overflowing wastebasket. The paper fell to the floor and Melissa grimaced, delicately picked it up by an edge, set it back on the trash pile. She stepped out of the restroom and her breath vanished as quickly as a hook yanking a small fish from the water. A stranger was sitting across from Jake in the same spot where she had been, a large, paunchy man with a ruddy complexion and curly brown hair. The stranger smiled and waved to Melissa, ushered her over. Jake's camera was in the stranger's other hand, tiny in his palm, a toy. Jake's back was to her, his head bowed like a child being punished. She thought about her gun sitting in the glove compartment of their car outside. "Your boyfriend kept trying to take my picture," the stranger told Melissa as she walked over, fear slowing her steps. "I had to take his camera away." Jake looked miserable. "Sit down." The stranger patted the seat next to him. Melissa glanced around the diner, hoped someone was paying attention, that she could catch another person's eye. No one noticed her. "Sit," the stranger said again. Melissa did, felt his large body next to her. "Chris wanted more than a note," the man told her. And with those words, everything Melissa feared came true. There had been a hope she hadn't fully realized, a chance this man wasn't connected to them, just someone upset that Jake had photographed him as he had walked into the diner. That happened, Jake had told her. Often. This wasn't that. The stranger knew Chris Winters. "How'd you find us?" Melissa asked. He ignored her question. "The good news is Chris wants you alive." The stranger inclined his head toward Jake. "Doesn't much care what happens to your boyfriend, but I'll let you finish your dinner first. The pie looks delicious." Melissa stared sadly at the pie, retracing every step she and Jake had taken, every mistake they'd made. Using his car, not running farther away, charging credit cards at gas stations. His insistence that they stop at this diner, leaving the gun outside. Too many mistakes. "Can I have my camera?" Jake asked. The stranger turned it over in his hands. "I'll bury you with it," he said. "Good enough." The door to the kitchen swung open and the waitress approached their table. A jolt of hope went through Melissa. "Get you anything?" "Darling," the stranger said, and Melissa noticed the waitress's back stiffen, her face tighten. "Your pie looks delicious. I bet I could eat it all night." The waitress glanced at Melissa. Melissa wanted to communicate everything she could in her eyes, her fear and desperation, the secret empathy between women. "This man isn't with us. Please help." But the waitress just looked annoyed. "So you want the pie, then?" she asked. Her tone was impatient but practiced. She'd dealt with men like this before. "I said I could eat your pie," the stranger replied. "But not tonight. We'll just take the check." "Fine." The waitress left, and Melissa's hope left with her. The stranger turned back toward her with a smile. But his smile abruptly changed as he looked down, saw what Melissa had snatched off the table, and pressed against his leg. "Well," he said, "look at you." Jake half rose to peer at the steak knife Melissa was holding against the stranger's thigh. "You really think you're going to stab me?" "I can't go back," Melissa said. The stranger rubbed his bristly chin. "The knife will hurt," he admitted, "but not enough to stop me from pulling my gun. You two won't make it out of here, and in the end, Chris won't care." The table fell silent. The stranger stared at Melissa, his eyes clocks winding down. "We can give you money." Melissa didn't know if this was true. She couldn't keep her thoughts clear enough to recall how much money she had, what remained in her purse. She and Jake had run off and taken nothing. "There's no money that can save me," the stranger said. "If Chris learns I let you go." "But we can give you—" "No." Those twin clocks ticking. "You two jumped off a cliff. There's nothing to grab on the way down." Melissa couldn't maintain the stranger's gaze, couldn't keep staring into his utter confidence. Jake hadn't moved since she'd grabbed the knife. Melissa looked at the kitchen door, hoped the waitress would reappear. The door stayed closed. Maybe, she hoped, the waitress had somehow understood their situation. Sensed the fear emanating from Melissa, decided to tell someone. Called the cops. Of course, the Winteresses had the cops, but at least it would give them time to— "Time's up," the stranger said. "Melissa," Jake told her, strained. "Give him your money." "You tune out just now?" the stranger asked. "I don't want your—" "Give him your money," Jake repeated, "and get out of here." "What?" Melissa asked. "Leave without me," Jake said. He can take me, but you go." "Sorry?" the stranger asked. "You get me," Jake told him. "And she gets a chance. That's what we're buying." "I'm not leaving you here," Melissa said resolutely. Their gazes wrestled across the table. "You don't have a choice," the stranger said. And he didn't get to finish speaking. Without any of them realizing it, the waitress was back, standing next to them, looking wide-eyed at the steak knife Melissa was pressing into the stranger's leg. "What are you doing?" the waitress asked. "Photography is all about the moment," Jake had once told Melissa. "You have to know the right one to capture." And Melissa chose that moment to shove the knife into the stranger's thigh. He swore in surprise and bent over while the waitress screamed. The middle-aged couple in the back rose, a shriek from the wife. The two men in the front turned, their eyes and mouths dark, wide circles. Melissa heard her own screams as she rose and saw the stranger's gun in one hand, his other grasping the handle of the knife in his thigh. Blood spread over his jeans like evening shadow. He lurched out of the booth and grabbed the waitress for balance. She jerked away, and he dropped his gun, grabbed the knife handle, and fell to the floor. Hands on Melissa's arm, pulling her, Jake telling her something lost in the commotion. Melissa felt lightheaded and unsteady, but she couldn't stop looking back as Jake tugged her, the waitress stumbling to her feet, the older man standing like a shield in front of his wife, the two lanyard-wearing men in front still staring. The stranger on the ground, trying to wrench the knife free. Jake let go of her hand halfway to the door. He hurried back to the booth, stepping around the stranger as the wounded man frantically searched for his gun. Jake grabbed the camera. Then he and Melissa ran to the door, the waitress behind them. The first shot exploded like a giant angrily slamming its hands together. Melissa turned and saw the waitress fall. Jake pulled her to the door. Melissa looked down. The waitress's face was a stark white as she tried to crawl. Another shot and the diner's front window cracked. One of the men who had been in the front booth lunged forward, his lanyard swinging. He reached the door at the same time as Jake and Melissa, but the doorway was too tight for all three of them. At the gun's third shot, that man's hand slipped from the door handle. He fell heavily to the ground, his left hand waving as if desperately calling for attention, his right hand clutching the bullet wound in his neck. On his knees, he crawled back to the safety of the table. The diner door swung open and Melissa ran out, felt the cold rush of December, heard the heavy silence of night. Jake spent too long at her car door but finally forced it open. The cloth seats, the dust-stained console, the interior light, a halo. Jake's door slammed closed and the old silver Honda Accord jerked backward. The parking lot receded somewhere behind them. After a few minutes, the car slid to a stop on a hill, off the road. Jake's hands stayed tight on the wheel. He was breathing loudly in spurts. "Jake?" Moments later, Melissa sat alone. She watched Jake's silhouette in the dark, a tall figure with a camera just outside the light from the car, snapping endless pictures of the carnage in the diner below, like an artist standing on the edge of the earth and painting a picture of hell. Melissa closed her eyes, desperately wanting to run even as Jake made this moment last forever. Chapter 2. Lucky. "You know he drank?" Sheila Banks exclaimed to whomever she was talking with on the phone. She was sitting on the living room couch, an outdated floral print sofa the homeowner had refused to place in storage for the open house. Lucky Wilson gazed at Sheila from the kitchen, his hands absent-mindedly spreading his Lucky Wilson, an agent you can trust, business cards and a fan on the linoleum counter, stacking them like a blackjack dealer, fanning them out again in a practiced wave. "I heard it was a lot!" Sheila shrieked. To Lucky, her voice felt like a drunk bear stumbling inside his skull. The first time Lucky had murdered someone, well, someone he hadn't been paid to kill, was when he had just started working for the Winterses. This had been a car accident late at night on an empty road, a minor fender bender, and the man driving was belligerent, yelling a stream of expletives so colorful that Lucky was impressed. But the man hadn't stopped there. He'd engaged Lucky physically, and Lucky had ended his life with a single gunshot. The other unpaid killing happened nearly a decade later. A new teacher at his daughter's daycare had been fired after it was discovered he was inappropriately touching the children. A week after he had been fired, Lucky had gone to his house past midnight, slipped inside wearing a ski mask and gloves. Only 2 occasions. So far. Sheila's irritating manner was driving him to a third, and Lucky's dejected state of mind didn't help. In addition to everything else in his life that troubled him, Lucky hated holding open houses. He especially despised neighbors strolling through only to judge and gossip. He'd known Sheila was going to be trouble, could tell by the way she'd hurried over to introduce herself as one of the heads of the Homeowners Association. "I'll make sure you get the right buyers," she'd promised and winked. He fanned his cards again and stared at Sheila through the kitchen pass. Her phone was tucked between her shoulder and ear. A long brown coat wrapped tightly around her, even though Lucky had kept the house invitingly warm, almost as if she wore it to shield herself from the unflattering surroundings. Sheila glanced up and met his eyes. Surprise or concern crossed her face. Lucky wasn't sure which. He picked up a bottle of water from the counter, twisted off the top, sipped, and stared. Sheila looked away. He heard her clear her throat and continue. "I'm sorry?" Lucky turned and gazed at the dismal kitchen. White paneling needing a coat of paint, sluggish yellowed appliances, loose knobs too worn for a screwdriver to tighten. The houses in this Falls Church neighborhood of Northern Virginia had been built in the 1940s, but, given their proximity to D.C., still sold near or over $1 million when renovated. But this owner, a widower in his 80s who had reluctantly settled into an assisted living center, had no interest in spending a dime on updates. Lucky would be fortunate to get 90% of its worth. Sometimes, of course, there was a surprise. Full ask or higher on a property that didn't warrant it. The new owners harried because of the competitive D.C. region housing market. Property sold in almost complete states of disrepair. Imaginative buyers seeing promise in a shining rebuild. Lucky imagined the excitement of a young couple in a house they'd just bought, and tears welled in his eyes. He forced himself to focus on the job and not his marriage. "I don't know who would buy it," Sheila exclaimed into her phone, and, with that, Lucky walked to the knife rack and pulled out a long chef's knife. "He's in the kitchen!" Sheila shrieked. Lucky hadn't even heard the front door open. He slid the knife back into the rack, wiped his wet eyes on his sleeve, and left the kitchen for the living room. A couple waited in the entrance, watching Sheila as she beamed at them from the couch, like rabbits warily regarding a leering wolf. Lucky sized them up. White, late 20s or early 30s, wearing Sunday church clothes, the man clean-shaven, the woman in heels. The man, still slim before the softening effects of middle age, wore a dark blue suit with tan leather shoes and a matching belt. She was pretty, with a thin, sharp face, and looked around the house with quick, bird-like intensity. A dark blue ankle-length dress. The princess-cut diamond on her wedding ring glinted. Yuppies, Lucky figured, who rented in D.C. or Arlington and were looking for a bigger home to fill with family. Young and married and happy. Lucky hoped he'd be able to speak past the lump in his throat. He used to be so much better at compartmentalizing. "Is the open house still going on?" the man asked. Sheila watched them appreciatively from the couch. Lucky figured this couple fit the bill for her, especially after a black family had come by a half hour earlier, and Sheila's face had held nothing but distress. Lucky had cheerfully imagined slapping her with a hammer. "It is," he answered. "Come on back to the kitchen and sign in. My name's Lucky." "Lucky?" the woman asked. Sheila barked out a laugh. "My father was a gambler," Lucky explained. He'd done this his entire life. He said that having a son was like, "And I'm Sheila Banks." Sheila rose from the couch. "President of the Homeowners Association. Do you mind if I join the tour? This is such a lovely neighborhood." "Well," Lucky began. "Only 3 houses in the neighborhood share this model," Sheila said, and the couple followed her into the kitchen. "And this is such a great community for families like yours." Lucky's hands tightened into fists. There was no way to get rid of Sheila Banks. If he asked her to leave, then he risked offending her and losing any shot of selling homes in this affluent community. He'd heard stories of that happening to other agents. So he and Sheila guided the couple up the carpeted stairs to the 2nd floor, Lucky hoping they didn't notice the loose railing. "Watch out for the loose railing," Sheila told them. They stopped in the primary bedroom, a bare, narrow room that Lucky knew could be salvaged with a nice clean coat of paint. "The bedrooms are a little small," Lucky began, "and in desperate need of new paint," Sheila added. "But smaller bedrooms were the style at the time this house was built," Lucky continued. "Now you knock out the 2nd bedroom, expand this room, connect it to the bathroom at the end of the hall. That gives you a sizable primary bedroom with an enclosed bath and—" "But they'd lose a bedroom," Sheila interrupted. "Right, but they'd still have 2, and if they convert the basement—" "I'm sorry, but that doesn't seem like a good idea." Sheila smiled at the couple. "I can't imagine losing a bedroom is going to help resale, can you?" "It gives the house a more modern look." Lucky's voice was strained. "And you have to consider—" The phone in his left pocket buzzed. Lucky always carried 2 phones. The phone in his right pocket was for family and real estate. It was the phone where Lucky kept photos of his wife and daughter and a bulging library of real estate and puzzle apps. Lucky loved puzzles. The phone in his left pocket had nothing on it. It was a generic phone that had been given to him by the Winterses last night, buried in a plastic bag next to a certain tree in the woods behind his house. He stopped talking, pulled out the new phone, stared at the screen. "You take that," Sheila told him. "I'll continue the tour." He gazed at the message for another minute, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. The young couple and Sheila were heading back to the stairs. "The basement," Lucky said as he hurried behind them, "is right through the kitchen, in the door next to the pantry. Now, it's not finished, and there was a possum, well, more like a community of possums, but—" In his rush, Lucky's foot slipped on the stairs. He caught himself before he fell, but nearly yanked the old banister from the wall. "I think we've seen enough," the husband said. He and his wife glanced at each other. Lucky knew that glance well. "Are you sure?" he asked. He could tell the sale was lost, but after 15 years in real estate, pushing back was habit. "The basement isn't finished, but we're sure," the husband confirmed. "I'm sorry, it didn't work out," Sheila told them. Asking Sheila to leave would be a poor choice, Lucky decided. Better to lock the front door, choke the life out of her with his bare hands, hide her body in the basement. Come back in the night and drive her corpse away. Toss Sheila Banks in the bottom of a new home site being built down the street and bury her deep. He smiled at the fantasy. Lucky placed his hands in his pockets, felt a reminding vibration from the phone in his left pocket. The phone from the Winterses. "My husband and I are moving to D.C. from California in a couple of months and are heading up soon to look at houses. Are you available for showings? Can we talk later?" "Hopefully we'll have better luck next weekend," Sheila called. He heard the front door open and close. Lucky kept staring at the message. "How about tonight?" he wrote back. The response came right away. "Midnight." "Sounds good," he replied. Another quick response. "This could be a life-changing sale for you." "I'm sorry," Renee said sympathetically after Lucky finished telling his wife about the open house. She was sitting on their kitchen counter, legs crossed, a glass of wine in hand. "Sounds like a waste of a day." Lucky examined the plate he'd pulled from the dishwasher, searching for water spots, avoiding looking his wife in the face. "I did almost kill the president of the HOA. That would have made me feel better." Renee took a sip. "Sometimes you have to do something just for yourself, you know." "But I do have interest on the place in Sterling. Meeting with a family and their agent next week." "The Rambler?" Renee had a terrific memory for details. Lucky's memory, as he strolled further into middle age, was dulling. He'd even started carrying a little notebook filled with scribbled details about showings. Details he now needed glasses to decipher. "That's the one." He put away the plate, pulled out a coffee mug. "How about you? Ready for tomorrow?" Renee was an assistant headmaster at Eastwise, a private elementary school in Annandale. One of the school's largest funders was touring soon, and the staff had spent the weekend prepping for his visit. "We found so many vape pens. But on the bright side, now a bunch of us know how to vape. I felt so cool. Also, your special package arrived today." He nodded. "You okay? You look so angry." Lucky kept staring into the clean mug. "Just thinking about work." He'd discovered Renee's affair by accident, a startling revelation weeks ago via their Maps app one morning as Lucky was trying to find directions to a new client's home. The address in the app's archives surprised him, given that he was the only one who used it. Their 17-year-old daughter, Mary Beth, had just earned her license, and they rarely allowed her to drive, and Renee generally only went to work and back. As he researched the address, wondering if it was one he'd forgotten to clear, he discovered who it belonged to. William McKenna, a teacher at Renee's school. Lucky knew him from occasional dinner parties at their house. White and blonde with reddish cheeks and a heavy-set bearing, on the edge of being overweight. He'd seemed inconsequential, the kind of man met and promptly forgotten. Lucky had also noted the date that the address had been accessed. A Tuesday. A day that, supposedly, Renee was at work. Lucky had asked her about him later that night. "How's that William McKenna doing?" And she'd replied with a vague, "I don't really talk to him." But Renee had paused before she answered, and Lucky had interrogated too many people to miss those kinds of signs. "We need to talk about your daughter," Renee said now, gently swirling the remaining wine in her glass. Our daughter. Not for this. I'm too annoyed. She's been lying to us, even more than usual. She didn't go to the movies the last 2 weekends. Instead, she went to parties at some friend's place in Herndon. Who do we even know in Herndon? No one. Lucky closed the upper cabinet, which was filled with mugs from Mary Beth and Renee with sayings like, best farter ever and #1 dad at going #2. How'd you find out about the party? Lucky asked. Snoopy. Snoopy was an app Renee and Lucky used to track their daughter's social media and email. I don't know what's happening at these parties, but if she isn't telling us about them. She set her empty glass down, let the sentence hang, the silence explaining itself. A bottle of wine on Sunday nights had become a tradition for Renee, dating back to when Mary Beth had entered her preteen years. Lucky rarely drank, especially compared to how much his parents had. I'll talk with Mary Beth, he offered. Tonight? Renee asked. We can't have her sneaking out and going to parties. Renee reached for the bottle. Now that's just good parenting. Lucky left her in the kitchen. He wondered if someone watching their conversation would have noticed the tension, how Renee drank alone, how he hadn't once looked at her face, or if it just would have seemed like the familiar trappings of a 20-year marriage. Lucky didn't know what a happy marriage was supposed to look like. His own parents had stayed married until cancer had come for both of them when Lucky was in his early 20s and stationed overseas. He didn't remember any instances of either of them straying, even significant fights. At least, not when they were drinking. And in his memories, they were always drinking. Lucky headed upstairs, knocked on Mary Beth's door, waited for a yeah before walking in. Hey, Mary Beth said without looking up from her phone. It was odd to Lucky how much Mary Beth resembled Renee, as if their family had relatively unimaginative genes. Mary Beth had her mother's angular cheekbones and wide eyes, like long brushstrokes had been used for their faces, and her mother's dark hair. But where both Lucky and Renee were no longer trim, Mary Beth had an easy thinness. Even now, she casually sat in a yoga pose, one he recognized as the lotus position from the virtual classes Renee and Mary Beth did together, each of her heels propped up on the opposite knee as she sat cross-legged. She glanced up. What's wrong? Wrong? You look so sad right now. Didn't Mom tell you your special package came? Lucky closed her door behind himself. Just looking at you sitting like that hurts. His daughter grinned and he settled in the chair opposite her bed. In addition to her mother's looks, Mary Beth also had her approach to tidiness. Clothes were in piles throughout the room. Renee was the same way, and it had taken a while for Lucky to realize that there was a method to her disorganization, and every pile had some relevance. A pile of clothes she'd bought that needed to be returned, another for outfits still tagged that she wanted to try on and hadn't yet, a heap of older jeans and shirts that were eventually going to be donated. And in addition to the piles of clothes, school papers and folders and books and various beauty products Lucky didn't understand were all over the dresser, desk, and floor, and the walls were covered with posters of musicians. Billie Eilish, The Weeknd, Atmosphere, Marcus Pena, Lizzo, BTOB, all performing, their expressions strained. Being in Mary Beth's room always made Lucky feel like someone was shouting at him. So, what's up, Dad? Tell me about the parties. Parties? Mary Beth tried to keep her voice composed, but he noticed she'd stopped scrolling. The parties you went to the last 2 weekends, instead of the movies. Mary Beth set her phone down, glared at her father accusingly. Were you looking at my accounts again? Yes. You had no right. The parties. She relented. I didn't want to tell you because older guys were there. How old? Like, college? College. Lucky couldn't hide his incredulity. You're still in high school. I'm a senior? As if he was unaware. And I promise I didn't know they'd be there the first time. And the second? Yeah, I knew then. A small smile despite herself. Something Mary Beth was keeping secret. She liked one of these older boys. Lucky wondered if Renee had similar moments, times when she was lost in thoughts about William. Found herself smiling. You can't go to parties with college boys, he said. I know, Mary Beth replied, her eyes earnest. I'm sorry. Far too easy. And no more phone tonight. He held out his hand. Mary Beth was going to protest, but she looked at him and something in her face changed. Lucky generally kept his patience, his tone even. Renee was the one who raised her voice. But he was the one Mary Beth feared. Lucky wasn't sure why. Lucky heard Renee head upstairs to bed, but he didn't follow her. Instead, he sat on the leather recliner next to the couch in their living room, the lights off and the room dark. And he felt tears. Tears at the thought of Renee with someone else. Tears at how easily Mary Beth had lied to him. Lucky reached for the controller on the end table. He turned on the lights of the Christmas tree and it blinked to life. Green and red lights illuminating the ornaments, a mix of glass and wood and plastic. Children pulling sleds, smiling Peanuts characters wearing stocking caps or holding wrapped gifts, silver and red balls, fake tan gingerbread families, Disney figurines Mary Beth had treasured when she was a little girl. Another button turned on the lights of the garland over the fireplace mantel, fake plastic holly and berries and soft white lights, wise men accompanied by camels and sheep as they voyaged from one end of the mantel, a barn in the center lit from inside, a small window showing Mary and Joseph kneeling over a bundle of straw. And of course, the Christmas village, spread out on the living room table and fireplace hearth. But Lucky couldn't think about that now. He sat in the chair stiffly, trying to corral the emotions tormenting his chest, the thoughts polluting his mind. He couldn't be in his house anymore, and that was a terrible thing to realize. Lucky turned off the lights and rose, headed through the dark living room and dining room, completely unable to see, but with the comfort of someone who has lived in the same home for years. Or someone used to walking through the dark. He opened the patio door and headed outside, rubbing his arms in the brisk cold. The exterior office hadn't been entirely necessary, but Renee had been helping out her school by teaching classes virtually during the pandemic, and she'd said the separate, quiet space helped. For some reason, that sentiment had made Lucky feel terribly lonely. The quarantine at the start of the pandemic had been a shocking adjustment for their family, as it had for everyone else. Renee's and Mary Beth's schools abruptly moving to online education. Lucky's showings placed on hold, and homeowners worried about the uncertain future, deciding not to sell. Groceries delivered, along with everything else. Their home suddenly also a business office and classroom and rec center. Renee and Mary Beth had been distraught, but the dramatic lifestyle change had affected Lucky differently. Despite the news reports of crowded hospitals and rising death tolls, Lucky had found a warmth in seeing his wife and daughter more than he ever had, a joy during newfound game and movie nights, enchantment when observing his wife and daughter at their respective schools. They'd complained that they needed more room and, over that first summer, when a return to in-person schooling was still improbable, he'd had the backyard office built for Renee. Lucky loved the square one-room building. It had been designed to look like a miniature version of their house. A small sloped roof, faux white bricks, even a tiny dormer. He unlocked the door to the backyard office, now his, since the concept of remote learning for children had long ago passed, and walked in. The office was nondescript in the way Lucky preferred. Nothing but a rug and a desk and a chair. He pulled out his second phone, sat and waited, idly spinning back and forth. It would be a few hours before the Winterses called, but Lucky didn't mind. He felt calmer now, removed from the house and his family, his adulterous wife and deceptive daughter. Lucky needed something else, even an assignment from the Winterses, anything that offered reprieve from pain. "This could be a life-changing sale for you," they had written. Lucky wasn't sure why he believed them, but he did. And in his agitated state, any path toward peace, even a bloody path, held promise. Chapter 3. Ruby. Once upon a time, the Winterses ruled the triangle of D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. Their operation was, like the most callous criminal enterprises, ostensibly legal, a business powered by ruthless capitalism and tireless expansion, gods and American religion, profits fervently praised, tactics hotly defended from criticism. The Winters Holdings, Inc. was a proud commercial real estate development firm familiar throughout D.C., the name plastered on new construction where old buildings had once stood. Coming soon, a Winters property. The Winters Holdings, Inc. focused on D.C., but stretched into Maryland and Virginia, visiting neighborhoods decimated by poverty, their logo of a flying angel the promise of a soul being saved, a sinner guilty of the offense of financial duress, now forgiven. Gentrification tied to the enticement of a black-free block, the photos of new gyms and grocery stores and condominiums on their advertisements showing cheery white families. High-end retailers and cherished businesses that famously overcharged, rumored to eventually take up residence. No one discussed what would happen to the current occupants of these neighborhoods. The politicians and police were paid, the media enamored, the plight of the current homeowners silenced. And their plans quietly worked even when, ostensibly, they failed. Buildings in the midst of neighborhoods eroded by poverty and routinely ignored, the construction endless or stopped, structures barricaded by chain-link fences and graffiti-strewn wooden panels. These properties were intended to be forgotten, a tax write-off waiting on a never-to-come future buyer or economic revitalization. For all purposes, abandoned. Inside these buildings, if you chose to look, you would find things you didn't want to know about. Women barely dressed and shivering. Cases of pistols and rifles and ammunition. The Winterses had an empire. Yellow bricks laid throughout the D.C. region led by one man who, for years, had no public presence other than a Wikipedia page with the following information. Victor Winters is the owner and founder of Winters Holdings, Inc., a commercial real estate development company based in Washington, D.C. It wasn't until Victor's assassination, along with his associate and girlfriend Isabel Pike, that anyone asked questions. Victor Winters was wealthy, and Isabel was beautiful, and they had been murdered, and so the media and public were helplessly intrigued. And when ties were found to illegal activity, to human trafficking and gun smuggling, it was like a crackling fuse reaching a red bundle of dynamite. There were some arrests. A Black City politician who was already notoriously corrupt, a group of women at a high-end massage parlor, their male customers unidentified and freed, the owner of a local professional sports team tied to sex trafficking, although that story ultimately faded from attention. Victor Winters, who had switched from a shadowy figure to a revered criminal like Al Capone or John Gotti, was dead, and without a living person to attack or blame, the media and public's concerns waned. The signs for Winters Holdings, Inc. stopped appearing throughout the city. The existing signs were taken down, but the buildings remained, and the work inside them continued. Ruby Smith was, in many ways, the voice of the Winterses. For all the romanticization of the anonymity and danger of the dark web, the Winterses preferred the old days of hiding in plain sight, like the signs on their buildings, a taunting, "Here I am." And they chose a simple process to communicate with Ruby. On Sundays, Ruby would walk 3 blocks from her house in Winchester, Virginia, to a nearby church where she would pray. Sometimes, during prayer, she would be so overcome by anguish that she would weep. On the way back home, she would stop at a liquor store, eyes downcast. The liquor store was closed on Sundays, but the back door was always open for her. She would slip inside, and a man called Joe would give her money and a cell phone and a message. Joe would repeat the message 3 times. The first time, Ruby comprehended what Joe was saying. The second time, she absorbed it. The third time, she remembered it. As often happened with colleagues over the years, regardless of circumstance, Ruby and Joe developed a cordial relationship. Sometimes it took her more than 3 tries to remember the message, and they laughed at this. Sometimes Joe told her about the long drive from wherever he lived to the liquor store in Winchester, playful exasperation at having to come this far. And then, after Victor Winters was assassinated, Joe told her about the organization. He told her about the death of Victor Winters, the rumors that it had come at the hands of a rival gang, a specialized police unit, a government agency, a masked vigilante. He told her about the uncertainty among the soldiers, the problems of a vacated leadership, the fears of raids or federal investigation now that they were no longer concealed, the errors that had begun to occur. 4 naked girls stumbling outside a warehouse, blinking in afternoon sunlight as passers-by took photos. A shootout with a gang that left 2 civilians dead. The unshipped crates of weapons, the recipients worried about receiving anything related to the Winterses. It was a mess, Joe confided, and it lasted months. He still visited Ruby weekly, even without a message or money, just to keep her apprised. She enjoyed these visits, the way he turned to her for his unburdening. Aside from the Lord and Joe, Ruby didn't have anyone else. She devoutly but quietly went to church once a week, maintained a cordial relationship with the lawyers at the small bankruptcy firm where she worked as an office manager. Her nights were spent eating on a TV tray and watching old game shows. Jeopardy from when Alex Trebek was alive. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? School quiz shows with uncomfortably dressed students nervously offering answers. And then she would prepare the codes for the messages the Winterses had given her. It was a lonely life, Ruby realized, but a fulfilled one. One Sunday, she went to the liquor store, and Joe wasn't there. "Joe's not coming back," the man waiting for her said. "What happened to him?" The man shook his head. He was older and tall and thin and wore yellow-tinted glasses. Black curly hair contrasted with pale skin. An open brown leather jacket over a dark shirt and dark pants. Ruby didn't know why he looked familiar to her. Then he told her his name. "You look different than your brother," Ruby said. "You met Victor?" Frank Winters asked. "Once." "If Victor had lost 200 pounds and not gone bald, he'd have looked like me." "So you're running things now?" Ruby asked. He nodded. "Is Joe dead?" "No one knows what happened to Joe," he replied. "But you're one of the last people who saw him. Anything seem different to you last Sunday?" Ruby thought back to the prior weekend. Joe telling her the usual. The anxiety he'd confessed 2 months ago, after Victor's assassination, had been replaced by frustration. Soldiers grumbling about unclear directives. Money slowing. Ruby thought it best not to reveal any of that. Not really. He stared at her from behind those yellow glasses. Ruby almost felt his gaze prodding her mind, searching for answers. Eventually, he sniffed, pulled his nose, shrugged. He gave her a phone and money. Enough money to make up for the weeks when she hadn't been paid, even more than that. And he gave her a message to share. Frank only said it once, but Ruby remembered it. "Make the calls tonight," he said. "This is urgent." "Is this Lucky Wilson?" she asked, hours later, her voice unrecognizable to anyone who had ever spoken to her. High-pitched and young. Lucky's guarded tone. "Yes." Ruby remembered a show she'd seen on television years ago, a 60-minute special about a young popular minister who spoke in tongues. The reporter's skepticism did nothing to deter her fascination with the program or the video of the minister preaching to the congregation. He paused suddenly, his eyes wide and worried, and took uncertain steps, then collapsed as the crowd stood. And then the minister rose, voice and face strained as the camera closed in on him, words emerging that had an ancient sense to them, as if this was a language he had once known but forgotten. It reminded Ruby of the incomprehensibility of modern paintings and poetry she'd come across in a high school class, hidden messages on the verge of being deciphered. And so, when she spoke on the phone on behalf of the Winterses, Ruby was always reminded of that young minister, compelled to speak words he couldn't comprehend, delivering an untranslatable message that, nonetheless, was understood. Ruby closed her eyes and an identity filled her, a young woman she didn't know but welcomed and gave her body to, as if her body was a vessel for a wandering ghost. "Hi, Lucky, I'm Marie Cross. Thanks for talking to me so late. My husband couldn't make the call." She laughed, excited and chatty, a contrast to her normal speaking voice. "So you just get me." "That's not a problem." Ruby heard faint pencil marks on the other end. She imagined him scribbling notes as she dropped certain clues. Marie Cross, so late, and husband couldn't make call. "What can I help you and your husband with?" "Well," Ruby went on, "we're moving to DC because of my husband's job. And I was looking at listings in the Post on Saturday and saw some nice areas in Frederick. Do you work in that area?" Scribbles. Husband's job. Saturday Post. Frederick. Work in the area. "Yes, I'm licensed in both Virginia and Maryland." "Oh, good! We're looking for a single-family home. Just 1 bedroom. We don't need 2. 1 bedroom. Don't need 2. Are you looking for something new or used?" "We prefer new. I mean, we always hear that if you buy an old home, then you're just buying someone else's problems. But we're just starting out, so we don't have a ton of money. We're open to a condo." She offered another laugh. "I mean, we don't mind having neighbors, as long as they're not playing loud music or anything. We like it quiet." New. Condo. Quiet. "The other thing is, we're only going to be in DC for a little bit. 7 days. "What's your budget?" "We want to stay between 3 to 4. That's for a 1 bedroom. Maybe up to 5 for a 2 bedroom, but it'd have to be in really good condition. 7 days, 3 to 4 for 1, 4 to 5 for 2. She paused. "Can you help us?" "Let me do some research," Lucky said. "But I think so. I'll text you." "That's great! It was nice talking with you." She hung up. Ruby thought back to the conversation, tried to remember if she'd missed anything. Saturday Post, Frederick. It had been an article in the Washington Post on Saturday, an incident at the Heartbreak Diner in Frederick, Maryland. 2 people murdered in a shooting, 2 others who escaped. The story hadn't identified the names of the 2 who had fled, just that they were young, but it had identified the man they'd stabbed, who had accidentally killed 2 people in his attempt to stop them. Bruce Parks, a clumsy soldier for the Winterses. Marie Cross, a stand-in name for someone with the initials MC. Ruby had never called out for a job that required multiple contractors before. That's what she'd meant when she said condo. And that spoke to the urgency and to the new management. So much about this job was unusual. 7 days to complete the work. The money was good. Between $30,000 to $40,000 for MC, $40,000 to $50,000 for both her and her partner. "Can you help us?" Just then her phone buzzed with Lucky's reply. "I can help." Ruby felt the power of a spirit well within her as she prepared to share the message with another killer. Chapter 4. Jake. Jake drove most of the night, he and Melissa without conversation, just the nearly silent sounds of her crying. Once he pulled over and took a picture of her as she sat curved in the passenger seat, arms wrapped around her head, knees to her chin, a highway light revealing how her fingers clutched her own hair. And then Jake kept driving, deeper into Maryland, away from the cities and down dark highways and toward the eastern shore. He couldn't stop thinking about how Melissa had pushed the knife into that stranger's pants and the way it suddenly glided into his thigh. Could swear he'd heard the scratchy sound of blade scraping bone. The man's face when he and Jake looked at each other, his surprised expression just before the pain. The man with a lanyard crawling away from the door, blood running down his body like a broken fountain. Tears threatened. Nausea tugged. Jake drove. They reached the Bay Bridge and climbed its high, unsettling arc. Jake was compelled to take a picture not of the bridge, but of Melissa's worried reaction. Jake was mesmerized by her expressions. He'd never met someone whose emotions so naturally played onto her face or body, like a silent actor from a black and white world. But Melissa stayed huddled away from him. "Once I went skydiving," Jake said, "and the instructor strapped me to him and I asked, right before we jumped, why he got into training people. You know, parachuting with a student. He said he did it to face his biggest fear, dying alone." She didn't laugh. "Okay, I've never been skydiving." He glanced over the side of the narrow, high bridge. "Hopefully this won't be my first time." They cleared the bridge, and Jake pulled to a stop a mile away and took pictures of the road behind them, trying to capture how the dark resembled a giant snake swallowing the world. Finally, he saw a sign. An old wooden billboard lit from underneath by 2 spotlights, offering a location in a town called Wharfside and an idea. He stopped and photographed the billboard, the aged brown boards like a religious promise to pilgrims. Jake followed the sign's direction down a side road, drove until he saw the warehouse for Best Boats Storage, nothing else around but the occasional faint lights of houses in the distance. Jake parked in the warehouse's empty lot. The front door was locked and chained shut. He took a picture of it, the chain's impenetrable vines. Walked around the back of the building and saw that the warehouse was surrounded by trees, branches bare in the winter, limbs of frozen giants. No sign of an alarm on the window. Worth a shot. Jake removed his shirt, wrapped it around his fist. It took 2 punches to break through the window. The glass shattered and fell to the floor below. He peered into the dark warehouse, listened intently, legs and arms tense, ready to run in case an alarm cried. No sound, but water lapping nearby, somewhere unseen through trees. A gasp of breeze. Jake flashed back to the diner, the way the waitress had suddenly stopped crawling. The gurgling sound she'd made. He shook the glass out of his shirt before putting it back on, cleared out the broken shards from the windowsill, climbed into the building. The warehouse was a place for boat owners to store their ships in winter, so they didn't have to leave them in driveways or docks. The building, a giant indoor parking lot under a metal-arched ceiling with rows of lights hanging from the rafters. Many of the smaller boats were covered by fitted tarps, packed so closely together that Jake had to squeeze sideways between them. It was a mismatched fleet, everything from jet skis to tiny motorboats to a row of small yachts lining the back. It was the yachts that interested Jake the most. He walked over to them, ran his hands over their smooth sides, looked up high to their decks. Melissa was standing outside the broken window when he returned. "I think we're home." Melissa looked away. "And if we get hurt," Jake added, "now we can go to the dock." Nothing. "Get it? Dock like doctor?" Still nothing. Jake aimed his camera at her, his left eye wide so his lashes didn't crowd the viewfinder. He took a picture of Melissa looking away. The next afternoon, Jake sat on the edge of a pier and photographed the Chesapeake, sunlight shining on the water like diamonds bouncing on the surface. He reached into the paper bag next to him, pulled out a white powdered donut, bit into it. Breathed in cool air as gulls above called and swooped and soared. There wasn't much to the fishing town of Wharfside. A small community, quiet and closed during the winter. He'd found a convenience store near the town's edge, the kind of store for people driving past and fast. The kind of place where it wasn't likely a person would be remembered. Jake had heard about towns like this, places where Marylanders with money would visit over the summer to sail. Off-season, now in December, it was shut down. Little more than one small street of businesses, most of the stores dark, with signs announcing a spring reopening. The nearest houses were isolated from each other, buried within the woods. He took another bite from his donut and pulled out his phone. Shifted so Melissa's gun, stuffed in the pocket of his hoodie, stopped poking him in the stomach. There was something Jake wanted to do, and he wasn't sure if it was a bad idea or not. He thought about it, tapping his phone against his chin. "Call Eric," he told his phone. There was no way, Jake reasoned as the line buzzed, that the Winterses had somehow tapped his phone. Probably not. "Jake?" Eric Lou, his best friend, asked. "You all right? Is Melissa okay? Why are you calling me? That's such a bad idea." Jake swallowed, wiped powder from his lips with the back of his hand. "The Winterses don't know who I am, so there's no way they know my phone number." "You sure?" "Definitely." Jake hoped he believed himself. "We're hiding in a town called Wharfside in a warehouse for boat storage after almost getting killed in a diner, and Melissa's not talking to me. Things are really good." Jake told his friend about the diner, the stranger, the dead people. Eric listened quietly. Jake imagined the tension in his friend's face, the grimace that seemed to appear whenever Jake talked about Melissa. Wished he could take a picture of it. He and Eric had known each other since they were children, their moms in the same business, the boys brought together by circumstance and need, often staying together in their disheveled apartment building in a distressed area of Alexandria, Virginia, when their mothers went to work. Jake tended to wander, his life like a winding path through thick, tangled woods, but Eric held firm. Eric was that one calm kid in class reading a textbook while a hurricane of students gleefully screeched around him. Jake was close friends with him until Eric's mother died and he was suddenly whisked away to live with his family down south. But Eric had returned a few years ago, and he and Jake had easily fallen back into friendship. For so long, Jake had been immersed in photography, learning the mechanics of cameras, the whimsical nature of light, seeing a photograph the way others heard a song. But Eric's return, a surprise meeting at a grocery store when Eric walked up behind Jake, touched his elbow, said that he swore he knew him, had given Jake something he hadn't realized he missed: friendship. Eric taught him how to love someone else. Without Eric's example, Jake didn't think he'd ever have had the courage to let in Melissa. "Can't you two do anything quietly?" Eric asked once Jake finished his story. "You're leaving a trail." "Quiet's what I want," Jake replied. "What Melissa and me both want." "Two women came by my place," Eric said. "Twins. They asked me where you were." "Cops?" "No, I think they were with the Winterses." "They came to your place?" "Yeah." "What'd you tell them?" Jake asked. "The truth. That I had no idea where you and Melissa are." Eric paused. "But you have to listen to me. If you want to save Melissa and yourself, you need to go farther away." "Do you remember their names?" Jake could feel panic rising. "They didn't give them, and it didn't seem like I could ask. But just be careful. Something about them seemed off." Their conversation ended. Jake no longer had the same confidence he'd had moments ago before he'd called Eric, or when he'd assured his friend that this call was safe. Men and women were hunting him and Melissa, and nothing was safe. Jake was scared, the type of fear he'd felt when he was 4 or 5 and Eric and his mother weren't around, and Jake's mom would leave him in their apartment at night, Jake curled on the couch under a blanket with a television on because he was too scared to sleep alone in his room. This was that kind of fear, when Jake had to watch TV and lose himself as deeply as he could in the shows, ignore the shadowy apartment around him, the noises from the hall outside. He wanted to call his friend again, confess his fear, find sanctuary in honesty, shake away the sense of failure creeping behind him, something that had always lurked in the shadows of Jake's life, the flip side of artistic ambition.
This is the end of disc number 1. Please insert disc number 2. This is disc number 2.
Jake suddenly realized how tightly he was holding his camera, as if trying to bend it into some other shape. He relaxed his grip. The Lumix DC-FZ80 was a sturdy little digital camera, but Jake didn't want to risk warping the frame. It was the only camera he'd been able to grab when he and Melissa had fled. The man he'd bought the camera from had told Jake the lens was powerful enough to show the craters on the moon, and he'd been astonished to discover that this was true. Jake wished he'd thought to bring a tripod or other flashes, but he imagined this camera would be enough for however long he and Melissa needed. He felt a little better thinking about that, the idea that a future for them existed. Melissa was slouched in a folding chair on the deck of a yacht, wearing a big floppy hat and sunglasses when Jake returned. "You doing okay?" he asked. "No." She gazed at him evenly. "A cop came by." "What?" Melissa nodded. "A rent-a-cop. I saw him looking through that window you busted, shining a flashlight through." Jake felt overwhelmed. "Did he see you?" "Yeah. He came in and we talked about sailing." "What?" Melissa lifted the brim of her floppy hat, looked at him from behind the sunglasses. Her earlier numbness seemed to have dissipated. "No," she said patiently. "He didn't come in and we didn't talk, and he didn't see me. But he's probably coming back. Or someone will to check out the window, and they'll search the boats. Damn it. That's what I said. Melissa paused for a moment. But it's weird. I was happy when he was here, like, I hoped he'd arrest us. Why? We killed those people at the diner. We didn't kill them. They'd be alive if we hadn't been there. Jake didn't know how to respond. Where'd you get the glasses and hat? A closet down below. You going to keep them? They're cute. As if that answered his question. Jake waited a moment before he spoke again, worried about how Melissa would react to what he was going to tell her. I called Eric. Melissa yanked off the sunglasses. What? I'm sorry, Jake said sincerely. It was a mistake. I didn't think about it. I'm sorry. Jesus, Jake. I know, I just wanted to talk with him to make sure he was okay. Melissa still looked upset but didn't press her irritation. Jake loved her for that. The way she always seemed to understand his impulses and inhibitions, even now. What did he say? He told me the Winterses asked him about us, Jake replied. But Eric didn't say anything. I'm hoping they give up. Chris won't be happy until we're both dead, Melissa said simply. Jake didn't know how to respond. Again, failure whispered. I moved my car. Jake hoped this would offer some reassurance. Parked it off the side of some dirt road. But we can't risk driving anywhere, and we can't take a train or a plane with everyone looking for us. I figure we stay here tonight and find someplace new tomorrow. I guess we should. Melissa pulled off the hat, examined how it was woven. Had you ever seen someone die before? Melissa's question was a shovel plunged into his ribs. She kept talking before he could reply. I didn't know it would be like that, with that much blood. It was like blood was being pulled out of their bodies. Jake didn't respond. I wish I hadn't seen them. I don't ever want to see your pictures. Jake nodded. He couldn't look at them either. It feels like we're corrupt, Melissa said. Too dirty to ever be clean. I'm sorry, he told her quietly. I'm sorry I got you into this, that I brought you to that diner. I shouldn't have let you stop. Jake walked to the other side of the deck and looked over the railing at the swarm of dry boats. Should we go back? He asked. Try the cops. We have to run. That's the only way we'll be safe. Jake turned toward Melissa, but he didn't look at her. Do you want to run without me? He asked. No. Do you? It'd feel like drowning, he told her. And when I feel like I'm going to drown, I just want to hold you. So you'd pull me down with you? Well, yeah, but romantically. Jake explored the warehouse. A dozen skylights were spread throughout the ceiling, the late-year sunshine straining through dirty glass. A locked door led to an office from which, Jake assumed, the large bay doors could be opened. He went through the other boats, hunting for food, drinks, clothes, anything they could use. All he found were cases of water, some scuba diving gear he figured they could pawn, heavy boating equipment he didn't understand. Jake walked back to their boat, a case of water balanced on his shoulder. Hello? A man's voice. Jake stayed statue still, trying to control his breathing, listening hard. He set the case down. Hello? That voice again. Older and quaking. Scared. Anyone here? A grunt. A crunch of glass. Someone had climbed in through that broken window. Jake touched the gun that was still awkwardly stuffed in his hoodie's pouch. Footsteps approached, unsure and slow. Jake pulled the gun free, held it unnaturally in his hand. He'd only fired a gun once before, when he was in his early teens and a friend had taken him into some swamp in Alexandria, and they'd found a deer's dead body and filled it with bullets, the animal's long, black eyes staring until, finally, Jake was too shaken to shoot anymore. "Jake?" Melissa's voice from inside the boat, probably still in the bedroom, wondering where he had gone. That man's footsteps again. Quicker now, coming toward them, following Melissa's voice. "Where'd you go?" Melissa called out. Jake slipped behind the yacht. He walked around it, the bow that nearly touched the warehouse's back wall, hurried past the long side with a constellation painted on it in red and blue. Jake circled the boat until he saw an elderly man, a security guard in tan pants and a red polo, staring up the ladder. No gun or weapon on him. Nothing but a flashlight in his hand, his back turned, oblivious that Jake was walking toward him. Hi," Jake said. The guard's shoulders hunched like an arrow had suddenly dug between them. He yelped and turned, still in a flinch. His frightened gaze didn't leave Jake's gun. "Who are—" The guard's voice faded and he tried again. "Who are—" "Turn around," Jake told him. He heard the quaver in his own voice. "Please." "Don't," the guard whispered. "You don't have to." Jake pushed the other man's chest with his free hand, the shove harder than he'd expected. The old man stumbled, caught himself before he fell. Jake almost reached out to steady him. "Jake?" He and the guard both looked up. They saw Melissa on the deck, staring down. "Help me," the guard said to her. "Please." "What do we do?" Jake asked her. "He's seen us," Melissa said. "He'll tell them about us." Her voice broke as she spoke, the same sudden anguish on her face as when she'd stabbed that man at the diner. Jake's hand trembled as his fingertip touched the trigger. Chapter 5. Lucky. Lucky peered through binoculars as dawn broke over the Heartbreak Diner. The parking lot was empty. Signs on the window announced that the diner was temporarily closed. Lucky wondered if the closure would be permanent. When he was a kid, a murder at a business meant that the business could never continue. But times changed. He locked his car and walked across the parking lot. It would have been easy enough to sneak inside, but there was no need to draw attention to himself. Lucky often found that a direct approach was best in most situations. And if he was stopped and asked, he could produce a business card that identified him as a licensed private investigator from the 60-hour course he'd completed years ago. Not that he had any interest in working as an investigator, but it did help when accessing crime scenes. To know what cops were looking for. He'd left his house at 4 a.m. for the drive, a time of day that, ideally, ensured no one else would be here. Renee thought he was scouting properties somewhere outside Northern Virginia, and she'd sleepily murmured a goodbye after he kissed her on the forehead. She was used to his early mornings and late nights. Lucky thought about that forehead kiss as he drove here. It had been habit, reflex-conditioned over years. So much of his marriage consisted of an intimacy that had become casual. Quick kisses, monthly lovemaking. Even his appearance was intentionally unmemorable. Light brown hair always parted to the right, forever cleanly shaven. No tattoos or other markings. He was seemingly designed to be forgotten. Should life have been less casual? Had that been his mistake? Lucky forced himself not to think about that, tried the door to the diner. Locked. He glanced around, pulled out his lockpick, slipped on a pair of thin gloves. Fortunately, the lock looked new. Like people, old locks often aged into stubbornness. He used a tension wrench and pick, popped the tumbler like a held breath suddenly exhaled. At this point in Lucky's life, picking a lock was as easy as using a key. He opened the door, stepped inside, switched on the lights. Lucky walked up the small aisle between the counter and booths. Of course, the bodies and blood and markings from the investigation were gone, but Lucky wouldn't feel satisfied until he saw the crime scene with his own eyes. He went from one end of the diner to the other, peering under each booth, looking up at the ceiling, pushed open the door leading to the kitchen, walked around the smudged steel ovens and refrigerators, the crumb-filled counters that had yet to be cleaned. The seating area of the diner seemed undisturbed. The kitchen, in contrast, looked like someone had rushed out. Curious, Lucky thought, that the waitress had tried to leave through the restaurant and not the back door. But panicked people rarely made the best decisions. Lucky had witnessed many of these mistakes. Victims running out the wrong door, pulling open an empty drawer when they went for a gun, hiding halfway under their bed, hopelessly praying with their eyes shut as he approached. He found nothing but stains in the microwave, a cold tinfoil-covered pan of something unidentifiable in one of the ovens, saran-wrapped bowls in the fridge. A beep from the phone in his right pocket. Lucky pulled it out, opened the Watchful app, and a screen filled with an image of the front of William McKenna's house. The lump in his throat throbbed. Lucky had gone to William's neighborhood weeks earlier, parked a few streets away from his house, and loped through the woods. Climbed a tree across from William's home and attached a lipstick-size camera to a high branch. The same technique he used when tracking someone he was going to kill. Lucky stared into his phone as the front door opened and William walked to his car, the way he did every morning at this exact time, wearing a dark blue business suit, leather satchel slung over his shoulder. William opened the door to his silver BMW, the house and car relics from William's divorce years ago from a wealthy woman, and tossed the satchel inside. Lucky had learned long ago that people, often unconsciously, followed the same pattern every single day. And William's pattern was to leave at approximately 6:15 in the morning for Eastwise Private School. Lucky kept staring down into his phone as he stepped back into the dining area. "Freeze!" He stopped as if cold water had suddenly splashed his face. For a crazy, confused moment, he wondered if William McKenna was here. "Don't say freeze." Lucky realized there were two men in the dining room, both focused on him. "Hey, Lucky." It took a moment, Lucky still coming down from surprise, his mind adjusting like he'd walked from a dark room into light. "Chris Winters?" Lucky asked. Victor Winters had been a glowering mountain of a man, a giant force of nature. His nephew was markedly different. Shorter and slim, hair that nearly covered his eyes, arrogance in his expression, and a shiny white bandage on top of his head. The only similarity Lucky noticed between Victor and Chris was a sense of lurking danger, like wading into ocean waters that turn darker and colder the farther you swim. "This is Marley," Chris said, indicating his associate, a squarish, muscular man with a cold gaze. Marley just stared at Lucky and pushed open the long black jacket he wore. Lucky saw a pair of pistols with silver grips holstered on his waist. "How'd you know I was here?" Lucky asked. "There's a reason we gave you a phone." Marley walked past Lucky, stood directly behind him, and Lucky fought the urge to turn. "You're an early riser, Lucky," Chris said. "I hate that. But Marley here told me what my uncle used to tell him. Successful men don't wait for the world to start. Successful men start the world." "Good advice," Lucky said, still bothered by Marley standing behind him, those twin silver pistols. His shoulder blades tightened. "So, this job," Chris went on. "Things changed. You got an order to bring the girl in alive, right? Yeah. Dig 2 graves. A touch of eagerness in Chris's voice at that. Lucky could tell he'd wanted to say that line. What changed? Lucky asked. Instead of answering, Chris walked over to a booth. Looked like he wanted to sit, but thought better of it. Marley stayed behind Lucky. You worked freelance for my uncle for years, right? Chris said. But you never wanted more than that? Never wanted to get an employee badge? No. Chris seemed to be waiting for Lucky to say more. Lucky stayed quiet. He never told cops or crooks more than they needed to know. Everything fell apart after my uncle was killed, Chris said, and Lucky saw a moment of vulnerability in the younger man. That arrogance turned indecisive, a young lion with a limp. We're still putting everything back together. Lucky had heard stories about Victor Winter's death, the dark rumors of his murder coming at the hands of a rival crime organization, a mysterious vigilante, a secret law enforcement unit that went beyond the books, a group of trafficked women who had finally fought back. Or a member of his family. People always whispered around the dead. And now my other uncle is out here from Vegas, Chris said. You met Frank yet? Slim guy? Wears yellow glasses like he's from the 70s? Lucky shook his head. He heard Marley breathing behind him, imagined he could feel the other man's breath on his neck. He's out here because after Victor died, no one knew what to do. We lost people. Lost money. Lucky's phone shivered, but he didn't dare move and risk surprising Marley. Chris was still talking. Lucky tried to listen despite his utter certainty that his phone was alerting him to movement at William's house. Maybe William had returned home with Renee. His morning plans changed because of Lucky's early departure, the two of them hurriedly seizing a quick opportunity for sex. For love. Too much has happened, Chris was saying. Our men dying, some just disappearing. Suppliers worried they aren't going to get paid. Territory being lost. It's time I took over, brought the Winterses back to the place where my uncle had us. Another notification from his phone. Lucky imagined the screen showing Renee's car parked, the driver's side door hanging open in her rush, one of her shoes kicked off and left on the porch, the shape of her leg as William lifted her skirt, the two of them embracing in his open front door. And Chris Winters can't do that if everyone knows he got cucked and knocked out. That distracted Lucky. Wait, he said, confused. I thought you're Chris Winters. I am. Chris looked just as confused. The third person thing threw me off. I told you, boss, Marley said to Chris, still behind Lucky. It's weird when you do that. My uncle did it. Nobody would have dared correct him, Lucky thought. Anyway, Chris went on, we don't need some outsider from Vegas taking over, even if he is family. Chris, I need our soldiers to know who's in charge. So I need to make an example out of Melissa. Lucky noticed the burn in Chris's eyes as he spoke, the flush in his cheeks, the tremble as he said her name. Hate from scorn to love. Lucky didn't care about Chris's youth. He'd accepted that, as he aged, the people he worked for would be younger. But in that moment, Chris was suddenly a kid, impulsive and rash, a look on his face similar to his daughter's when Lucky confronted her about the parties. Her name's Melissa? Lucky asked. Melissa Cruz, Chris said, that venom still there. She ran off with some photographer. Brained me on the way out the door. Chris touched the edge of the white bandage on his head. We're here to give you photos, information, anything else you need. No one escapes Winter. A moment of silence. Is That a new motto? Lucky asked. There's a slogan now. Do you like it? Chris asked. Well, I mean, it's not great, Marley offered. I told you that, boss. It sounds like Game of Thrones or something. Honestly, I'm not in love with it, Lucky added. Chris's expression darkened. No one escapes winter. Or winters, whatever, he said, his voice firm. And killing Melissa is our priority. Got it. But Lucky knew this effort was misguided. If Chris was worried his men were having doubts, taking revenge on his ex-girlfriend wasn't going to reassure them. Lucky remembered a homeowner last year who, rather than update his primary bathroom, had opted to spend money on landscaping. Lucky had attempted to convince him that the yard, which admittedly needed work, wasn't going to deter buyers, especially once they got inside the house. But this homeowner, an advertising executive, had insisted, and the house had finally sold, but for less than Lucky knew it was worth. Sometimes, when success is small, it's a sign of larger failure. I got the message that I'm not working alone, Lucky said. How many others are on this job? The Russo twins, you, your boy Seth. Your boy Seth. Lucky tried to keep his expression impassive. Why so many? Lucky asked. Any one of us could find them. And now, maybe you'll find them faster. Lucky didn't like that answer. More people in the field meant more chances for mistakes, loud, clumsy incidents like the one at this diner. Victor Winters would have done things differently. I thought the twins were out of the area, Lucky said. He knew of the Russo twins, Bianca and Adriana. Pretty and blonde and from some Eastern European country. Came to the States posing as sex-trafficked teens, but they were secretly working with the trafficker to keep the other women in line. Once that trafficker was killed, the twins went on their own and eventually ended up with the Winterses. The twins go where the work is, Chris told him. His sense of malice, a bullying sort of mischief, was back. Speaking of that, you going to call Seth? Work with him on this? No. He said the same thing about you. Lucky didn't reply. I want to give you something, Lucky. It sounded like a threat. Lucky's poker face was starting to ache. What's that? A promise, Chris said. You do this job, you take out these two, and you can leave. What? Chris smiled. I know why you're working for us. I know what happened with the army. Why my uncle wouldn't let you stop. You do? You want to live your life with your family, Chris said. Retire from this and just sell houses, right? Lucky's heart hammered, but not with fear. Something else, excitement, as if he was digging and his shovel had just uncovered the edge of a treasure chest. That's right. Lucky hadn't realized, until that moment, how much he wanted what Chris was offering. He'd worked with the Winterses for so long that being free from them was a forgotten hope. And then suddenly Lucky felt the wind knocked out of him. Was this how Renee felt about their marriage? My uncle threatened people to get what he wanted, Chris was saying. It all came through fear, and that worked for him. I'm different. Chris doesn't want to threaten you. He wants to give you what you want. If you do this for me, then... Chris stopped talking, squinted into Lucky's face. What is that? Something like horror in the young man's voice. At Chris's tone, Marley stepped around Lucky, looked him in the eyes. You're crying, Marley exclaimed. Lucky wiped the tears from his cheeks. I'm sorry. Chris and Marley seemed dumbfounded. They exchanged uneasy glances. You're crying. Marley said again, as if this was something contagious. It's just... Something inside Lucky had been turning over, deep in his gut, and now it rose. An earthquake rattling his emotions. I'm so sorry. This is... weird, Chris said. A terrible clenching pain seized him and Lucky bent over, wheezed. Are you going to hurl? Marley asked. He and Chris took a quick step back. It's my wife. Lucky couldn't stop himself. This was something, a distant part of him realized, that he needed. The rare kind of calm that only comes through confession. It seemed the only way to quell the panic scrambling inside him. She's sleeping with someone else. I just found out. Lucky was crying too hard to see either Chris or Marley clearly, gasps shuddering through his body. When you said I'd be free to go to my family, Lucky told them between hard breaths. Well, I just don't know if my family will still be there. Lucky's face was on the floor, the cold linoleum like balm. He stretched out and flattened his body. This wasn't the first time anxiety and grief had overwhelmed Lucky. 3 days ago, while shaving in the morning, alone in the house, Lucky had burst into tears. Only for a few minutes, but those tears were uncontrollable. So were his sobs, deep, body-wrenching sobs. He didn't know why Renee's transgression stayed in his thoughts, tugging like an untrained dog on a leash. But he couldn't stop imagining how often she must think about William, their secret texts and whispered phone calls, the irresistible attraction when they saw each other at work. Lucky had never felt that type of excitement before, but he could imagine it in Renee. Hey, a foot nudged his shoulder. Bro? Lucky rose to his knees, shuffled toward Chris and the napkin he was offering. I'm so sorry, Lucky said. He noisily blew his nose. I don't know what's happening to me. I think you're having a panic attack, Marley said. Yeah. Lucky nodded, shakily rose to his feet. Would one of you do me a favor? Would one of you hold me? Or maybe both of you? Marley and Chris glanced at each other. I think it'd be weird if I did it, Chris said. Since I'm in charge? Boss, Marley replied. It's not like we have HR or something. Then you hold him. Please? Lucky asked weakly. His knees felt like they might give out. Here, Marley said, and he hurried to the door, brought over an empty coat rack. Try this. Lucky wrapped his arms around the rack, his tears wetting the wood. This is better, thank you. And truthfully, there was something strangely comforting about the wooden rack. Lucky had never been particularly given to emotions, but he often had longings he was able to ignore. One was a sense, when he embraced Renee or Mary Beth, that he didn't want to let go. The emotion in the embrace was like a blanket to him, and when they pulled away, the blanket was tugged off. And Lucky was left cold and alone. But the coat rack didn't pull away, and it didn't judge him or make him feel needy. There was a resoluteness to the wood that Lucky recognized, and he held on to it the same way a child might clutch a doll, as if this was one of the only things they could fully trust. Hey, Lucky, Chris said, and Lucky realized he'd momentarily forgotten about the other men. He stepped away, wiped his eyes. We'll find someone else for this job, okay? Chris told him. You've been good for us, but you're cracked. You need to take care of yourself. No, Lucky shook his head. I can do it. I'm fine, I promise. You were like blubbering, Chris said, and really having a moment with that coat rack. That made me so uncomfortable, Marley added. I'm okay. Lucky's voice was ragged. Don't take this chance away from me, Chris. Please, I want to do this. I need to do this. Christ, okay, Chris said. Just don't ever do that in front of me again. I feel gross. Marley, give him the information and let's go. Yeah, okay, Marley said. Jake Smith and Melissa Cruz. I got their pictures here. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through it. And at that moment, Lucky was grateful that his face was a blurred mask of tears, that Chris and Marley were too uncomfortable to look directly at him. Otherwise, they would have seen his surprise. Jake Smith. Lucky knew exactly who Jake was. Chapter 6. Melissa. Did you tie those right? Melissa asked. Jake looked up at her from where he was kneeling behind the elderly security guard. I have no idea. Trust me, the guard grimaced. It's tight. She and Jake had decided to bring the old man on board the yacht and to the empty second bedroom. They weren't sure what to do with him, but if there was one thing they'd found when exploring other boats, it was rope. Corded braids, thick and thin strands, fishing wires, and ropes perfect for tying someone up. They'd tried to tie the guard to a folding plastic chair, using a framed guide for fishing knots helpfully hanging on the wall, and couldn't figure out any of the knots. So instead, Jake and Melissa had used endless amounts of rope and dozens of small shoelace knots throughout. Small rabbit ears drooped up and down the guard's arms and legs. Melissa wasn't confident in their work. I'm going to keep searching the warehouse, Jake said. He handed Melissa the gun. I'll see if there's something else here we can use. Melissa sat on the floor of the small room after Jake left, her back against the wall. Helplessness was spreading through her, the same feeling as when she'd learned the depth and violence of Chris's crimes, when she'd realized she needed to leave him, or when she'd pushed the knife into that man's leg at the diner. It was a trapped feeling, the urgency to make a choice. And no matter which choice she made, the consequences would alter her life in ways she couldn't predict. The only certainty was, regardless of her choice, things would get worse. My name's Harold, the guard told her. Harold Thompson. Melissa didn't respond. After a few moments of silence, Harold stared despondently into his lap. Melissa felt sorry for him. She thought he was a cute old man, short with a little belly touching his thighs, disappointed eyes behind thick, square glasses. White hair combed into a faded crew cut. I'm sorry that we had to tie you up, she told him. You could let me go. Hope touched Harold's voice. Melissa was sad to take it away. We can't do that, but I promise you we're not criminals. We don't want to hurt you. You broke in here, stole supplies, kidnapped me, and you're holding me at gunpoint. But you're not criminals? And he doesn't even know about the diner. Grief fluttered like a wounded bird. Melissa abruptly stood, crossed her arms tight over her chest, started pacing. Hey, Harold's voice was soft. You can just let me go. I won't tell anyone you two are here. Melissa didn't look at him, kept pacing, thinking. We can't let you go. Not until Jake and I know what we're doing next. His name's Jake. That was probably a mistake, but she was too stressed to care. What's your name? Harold asked. Melissa. Jake and Melissa, he said slowly. And where was Jake? Melissa wished he would return. Not that Jake would be better in this situation, but at least she'd be out of this room. Maybe she could take a walk while Jake stayed with Harold. Get food, look for help. Think clearly about what they could do next. You ever shot a gun? Harold asked. My ex took me shooting. Melissa knew she shouldn't share more, knew this information would potentially come back to haunt her, but she didn't care. Like Jake's desperate, ill-advised outreach to Eric, she needed to talk. "You don't seem like you want to hold it," Harold said. Melissa stopped pacing, glanced at the gun in her hand. "I can help you," he went on. "All you have to do is let me go. I'll be out of here and you'll never hear from me again. You and Jake can stay as long as you need. I won't tell anyone." "Why would you help us?" Melissa asked. "Because I don't want trouble." "Aren't you a security guard? Isn't stopping trouble your job?" "Yeah, well, Wharfside isn't exactly Gotham." She couldn't help a small smile at that. "Please, Melissa, my granddaughter." The door to the room flew open and Jake returned, his camera bumping his chest. The smile on his face, its simple joy, was at odds with the urgent conversation Melissa and Harold were having, like a sudden sunny day in the middle of a rainy week. "Check this out," Jake beamed. He lifted his arm to reveal rolls of duct tape circling his elbow to his hand. "You think this will work better?" His enthusiasm slipped when he saw Melissa's face. "What's wrong?" She'd seen duct tape used to bind someone before. Melissa walked along the water's edge, following the path Jake had told her about. They'd strapped Harold to the chair, his hands and feet securely bound by duct tape, the same way she'd seen Chris do it. Melissa tried to push that memory away, but doing so was impossible, almost as if Chris himself was walking beside her. She'd met him 5 years earlier, during her last year of high school in Silver Spring, Maryland. Chris was a year older, a high school dropout who would hang out with friends at the school's parking lot during lunch. Guys gathered around his brown pickup truck like neighbors congregating on a porch. He saw her walking by and left his laughing friends behind to talk to her. "Hey." "Hi." Despite the admiring way the other boys had swarmed around him and his cocky stride toward her, Melissa realized that he didn't know what to say next. "I'm Melissa," she said. "Oh," speaking quietly, shyly. Soft eyes gazing out from under long brown hair, thin face, reddish haze of faded acne on his cheeks. Knife-sharp lips. "I'm Chris." She liked his uncertainty and nervousness, especially because he was older, the clear leader of those boys watching from his truck. But her girlfriends didn't trust him, and her mother didn't either. Melissa's mother was overly protective of her only daughter. She'd been in America over 20 years, moving from Panama for marriage with a soldier that quickly ended in divorce, left to raise Melissa alone. The two women were never close, and Melissa's teenage years were full of fights, almost always because of Melissa's mediocre grades. Her mother tried to encourage her through shouts, threats, punishments, abuse. None of it worked. Melissa stumbled through high school, and shortly after graduation, her mother had to return to Panama to take care of her own mother. She entrusted Melissa into the care of a good friend who gave her a place to live, while Melissa attended Baltimore County Community College. By that time, Melissa and Chris had been together almost a year, and he was comfortable around her. But her worried mother saw his nonchalance as arrogance. "You're beautiful, but you're not smart," her mother told her. "He'll take advantage of that." Those words and their wariness took a toll, a concern that slowly crept in and became Melissa's own. She worked at the college bookstore in between classes or hung out with girlfriends, and it didn't help that her friends often wondered aloud why she and Chris rarely saw each other. What could possibly keep him so busy? But Melissa knew the reason. He was with his family, and he'd told her about his family. About the Winterses and who they were and what they had done. The constant arrests of their associates, The whispers about his uncle, Victor, their wealth, and the rumors of how it had been gained. He would never join them, Chris promised her, but he had to spend time with them. And she understood the power of family, even one you distance yourself from. Family pulls you like water circling a drain. 4 years ago, Chris told Melissa that, even though the used car dealership where he had taken a job was a front for his family's business, none of their work was anything he was involved with. He was excited about the job, his first real one, and she was excited for him. He showed her his first paycheck and they marveled over it together, thousands more than she earned at the bookstore. She had no idea car mechanics made that much. And no idea they actually didn't. 3 years ago, Chris admitted his growing involvement with the Winterses to her, but promised it was on such a small scale that anything he was caught doing would result in nothing more than a slap on the wrist. And so the threat of danger was there, but distant. Like walking down a dark alley you're certain is empty. There was a thrill to that. And Melissa could see the thrill in him. Chris confessed all this during dinner when they were celebrating her graduation from BCCC. The celebratory feeling of the dinner had already been dimmed by the email she'd received earlier that day, informing her that her only attempt at a scholarship at Towson University, one of the few universities to which she'd applied, and the only one that had admitted her, had failed. She couldn't afford a loan, and despite his insistence, didn't feel comfortable borrowing from Chris. But she didn't let that disappointment, or the worry she detected in Chris's eyes after he'd told her more about the Winterses, ruin their dinner. 2 years ago, Chris had promised that the house he bought, an actual house just outside Baltimore with a yard and fence and basement and walk-in closets, had been paid for with money from his new role as assistant manager at the dealership and not from his family. Melissa had growing doubts about Chris's work and the secrets he kept, but she moved in with him anyway. Her mother had died months earlier while crossing the street in hectic Panama City, looking to her left, not seeing the city bus barreling toward her from the right. Melissa went to Panama for the funeral. A fast weekend when Panama's thunderous hot rains soaked everything. Her aunts had stared at her balefully, strained politeness and pointed side comments Melissa did her best to ignore. Her cousins were more cordial. Melissa's mother had often complained about them, telling Melissa what her sisters said about their children's work ethic and laziness. Maybe it was true. Or maybe, in Panama, parents distorted love and worry, turned them into a sharp-edged relationship with their children, one defined by the most dramatic elements of each emotion. The loss of her mother amplified something else for Melissa, her distance from Panama. Her mother had been her only significant connection to the country, and now that she was gone, that connection seemed tenuous, bordering on artificial. Even her grasp of Spanish was failing. Melissa and her mother usually spoke in English, given her mother's hope for fluency. And so, over the years, without practice, Melissa's Spanish had dulled. That first day in Panama was devoted to fierce concentration, deciphering the words of her weepy grandmother, red-eyed aunts, hushed cousins. Some of the language returned by the end of her trip, but Melissa knew that wouldn't last. She had a couple of close Latina girlfriends, but like her, there was an embarrassed loss of identity. Spanish only spoken when they wanted to convey something secretive, and, more often than not, they didn't use the right words. By almost all measures, Melissa and her friends had been raised in what approximated to a cliched view of typical Americana. English-language television. Books that she enjoyed but that were written by and about people who looked nothing like her. Even famous people who weren't white. Newscasters, celebrities, politicians. Often spoke in a way that had a universality to it, lacked distinction. That distance from Panama had only furthered when she dated Chris. Most of her friends had mentioned an uneasiness they felt toward him, or if they kept quiet, she noticed their tight reactions whenever she talked about him. But Melissa knew Chris better than they did, saw the conflict inside him to be good despite the evils of his family. He needed her. She was the anchor to what was honest in his life. But her relationship to him still separated her from those friends until only Carla remained, a quiet Mexican-born girl Melissa only spoke with sporadically. And so, when Melissa returned to Maryland and Chris, it was as if she was leaving what remained of Panama within her behind. And he was waiting for her, in the ways she needed, attentive and concerned that she was going to collapse. She did collapse, but only once. After that, she didn't cry again. Instead, another revelation surprised her, that of trying to adjust to a life without her mother's reprimands. Her schooling, her work, her relationship. All of Melissa's life was now purely, solely her own. Almost. Chris was increasingly caught up in his family's business, and that business distanced him from her, weighed on her. She sensed the danger increasing. Months passed, and Melissa wasn't working anymore. Instead, she lived off the money Chris gave her every month, and she spent her days watching television and exercising and talking with the girlfriends and wives of Chris's friends who also didn't work. They relaxed her, these new friends, other women also tangentially involved with the Winterses. These women who offered the comfort of surviving, models of how to adjust to their men. Because it was then that the killers came. They were quiet, serious men with harsh scars and broken fingers and haunted eyes. Men who smelled of death. Men who looked at Melissa in ways that went beyond want to some place darker. These men frightened her, especially when she started to sense their presence in Chris. The shyness she'd first loved in him was long gone. Now he was withdrawn and curt and often angry. Sometimes Melissa was scared he would hurt her. "I'd never hurt you, or anyone," Chris insisted when she questioned him one night, a rare moment of communion between them. But a week later, Melissa's worry got the best of her. She awoke in bed, alone even though Chris was home. She left the bedroom, saw a light in the kitchen. Walked downstairs, holding the banister to make sure she didn't make any noise. Unsure why she was being secretive, but some instinct telling her it was necessary. Chris was sitting at the kitchen table, his back to her, headphones over his ears, hunched forward and staring into his laptop. Melissa saw part of the video he was watching. She quickly walked away. She couldn't go back to sleep, terrified of what she had seen, frightened of what her life had become. She lived with a sense of foreboding, a constant premonitory feeling shadowing her, the light to the world obscured. The work Chris did was kept secret from her, and she was too scared to ask questions, worried about his answers. Almost hoping that if she did ever ask, he'd lie. But there was another feeling in her, doom approaching, footsteps in the dark. The insistent voice from her dead mother cruelly chastising Melissa for her mistakes, coldly assuring her that she had chosen poorly. And rather than rebel as she had always done, Melissa had a realization. This wasn't her mother's voice or advice. This was her own. And with that, Melissa decided to act. She woke hours later, wondering if she'd even gone to sleep, unsure what was a dream. She headed downstairs, walked through the quiet house. Chris was out, she assumed, but his laptop was still on the kitchen table. She opened it, logged in with his password. He'd written it down, carelessly left it on his nightstand a year ago and never changed it, and found the video he'd been watching. The video opened to a room of a man duct-taped to a chair, the camera apparently stationed in front of him. It took Melissa a moment to realize the room was in their basement, an unfurnished side room for storage that they didn't use. In the video, Chris approached him. Melissa couldn't stop herself from watching Chris's practiced ease, his ruthless persistence as he used a razor to dig out screams from the man in the chair, until that tortured man's head finally fell forward. She switched off the laptop. Her throat felt like it had been chewed. Melissa was too scared to confront Chris about what she had seen and too frightened to run. Their once heated love, already distant, now disappeared, like phone calls that came further and further apart. And then Jake showed up in her life, a burning light indicating some safe shore, a place Melissa realized she'd never been. When Jake asked her to run off with him, she took his hand. And now she was here, hiding with him in an eastern shore town, desperately running from the world. Melissa pulled out the burner phone she'd bought, used an app she'd discovered to read the text on her other phone, the one she'd left behind so Chris couldn't track her. It had been a lot to leave her phone. Thousands of photos and videos she sometimes scrolled through, retail and social media apps with saved passwords she no longer remembered, contact information from people she may never have the chance to speak with again. A lost life. The texting app was her only link, and it showed a text from Carla checking in, not worried yet, just wondering where she was. The message read as dutiful, as if she wanted to inquire, but didn't want to be drawn in further. Or maybe that's how Melissa imagined it. Texts from clothing and makeup stores offering sales, reaching out to Melissa as if her life had continued uninterrupted. She savored these texts, the way they brought normalcy. Texts from her other set of girlfriends, the ones involved with Chris's friends, asking, "Are you okay?" and "What happened?" and "Where are you?" Looking, Melissa knew for information to pass on. Messages from Chris coming like clockwork every couple of hours. Those were the only texts she didn't read. There was a store down the path, the convenience store Jake had told her about. Melissa didn't know how long they were going to stay here or where they were going next, but they needed food. She made her way down the path, water to one side, forest on the other. Jake had told her it was a half-mile to the store, and now that evening was settling in, the weather was colder and windier than she'd expected. The store turned out to be closer to a mile away. At 6 feet, Jake had a much longer and faster stride than she did at 5'2" and a half, she always added. And when Melissa finally reached it, she was happy to push open the heavy glass door and step out of the cold and into the light. A dozen aisles of snacks, auto supplies, drinks, and various odds and ends occupied the middle. A refrigerated section along one wall held cold drinks and food opposite a sleepy teen at a register. Melissa walked over to a rotating stand of sweaters with either Chesapeake or Maryland scrawled across the front. Pulled out one in her size, another in Jake's. 10 minutes later, she headed to the counter, arms full of food, the 2 sweaters slung around her shoulders. The cashier, a tall, orange-haired kid, kept glancing up at her as he scanned her items. Melissa was used to men eyeing her, but her paranoia gave his glances a sense of danger. She hadn't checked the news and wondered if the incident at the diner had already been reported, their faces everywhere. She pulled out her burner, scanned TikTok, searched for her name. Jake's name. The Heartbreak Diner. Nothing turned up. The unread messages from Chris were like a door Melissa was scared to open, but she had to read them. As unlikely as it was that Chris had changed his mind and accepted that she was gone, there was still room for hope. Sometimes he'd surprised her. Melissa opened up the most recent text Chris had sent. After the first few words, she numbly put her phone back in her purse and handed over some of her dwindling cash. She slowed her breathing, took out her phone again. "I'm going to cut you open from your... Miss?" Melissa hadn't realized she'd taken a few steps away from the counter, away from the orange-haired kid and her grocery items, now stuffed in plastic shopping bags. "Are you okay?" Melissa couldn't manage even a slight nod. She'd never heard Chris like this. "You're really pretty," the cashier blurted out. He bit his lip. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that." Melissa's normal response would have been to apologetically smile, to excuse the man from his own clumsy words, but she was too distracted. "I'm sorry, I just have a lot on my mind." "It's okay." At this response, his quick acquiescence, something unexpected hit Melissa, a longing. There was a longing for the stereotyped rurality in the store and town and in the shy boy's awkwardness that suddenly washed over her. Melissa wished she lived here, had grown up here, spent her life in a small house with the wind whipping outside and the lapping of the bay, and maybe falling in love with a boy like this and having nothing but each other. No danger and no fights. Just a long, quiet life and simple happiness. A garden without snakes. "But thank you for saying that," Melissa told him. The boy nodded, still looking down, and said something else. His voice was too low for Melissa to understand him. "What?" Slightly louder. "Do you want to go in back?" "In back?" "I heard Mexican girls like that stuff." Melissa gathered her bags and left. The walk back to the warehouse was quick, despite the heaviness of the shopping bags. Melissa walked resolutely, warmer in the sweatshirt she'd bought, carrying supplies and, with each step, a growing determination as she strode through the cold night. For years, her life had been out of her control. Chris was always in charge of their relationship, leading her in whatever direction he wanted. Jake was different, beautifully different, similarly following a path but without the inclination to shape it. He was content to let Melissa make choices. This wasn't a position she'd ever been in. She was used to reacting to everything, especially to the men in her life, and Melissa knew now that she couldn't continue that way. Not if she and Jake were to survive. A plan formed. She and Jake could hide in the warehouse for a few days, just long enough to befriend Harold, gain his trust, enough so he wouldn't turn them in after they let him go. There was a nice sentiment in that notion, the chance to win someone's trust again, to prove that they were more than simply selfish lovers. She and Jake would find a new place to run, somewhere beyond the reach of the Winterses, maybe out west where they could hide in anonymity. Put dozens of states between them and Chris, a home hidden in the deserts of Arizona, or lost in the plains of Kansas, or nestled in the Colorado mountains. It was possible, provided they didn't make more mistakes. Melissa reached the warehouse and walked around back to the broken window. "Hey." Jake emerged from the woods. "What are you doing?" Melissa asked. "Where's Harold?" "He's inside, and he has our gun." Chapter 7. Jake. Jake couldn't tell if Melissa was angry, bewildered, or both. And he was too embarrassed to meet her eyes and figure out which. Instead, he gazed up at the dark shadows of trees, their bare branches like ancient writing scrawled on the night sky. "I'm not a great guard," he admitted. "No?" A slight mocking tone in Melissa's voice. He blindly lifted his camera and took a picture in the general direction of her face. But even as Jake snapped the photo, he kept looking up, as if, should he stare hard enough at those branches, he would decipher their writing. "So what happened?" Melissa asked. "I had to use the bathroom, and I left the gun on the other side of the room from Harold, and I thought that would be okay. But when I came back, Harold had knocked his chair to the floor and dragged himself over to the gun." The wind through those branches was a whisper, a chant or prayer. "You walked back into the room," Melissa asked, "and Harold was on the floor with our gun?" "Yeah, then I walked back out." Melissa rubbed her forehead. "But at least he's still tied up," Jake added helpfully. A rustling sound within the warehouse. Maybe not so much anymore. Jake was trying to be glib, but he hated this feeling. The sense of failure returning, a bruise he'd borne since childhood. The idea that everything Jake did led to helplessness, the sense that he was never good enough. He remembered his high school counselor's face, the resignation when she'd told Jake he didn't have the grades to graduate. The way that experienced photographer had stared down at Jake's portfolio, dismissively flipping through the pages. His mother sitting quietly on the couch when Jake closed the door to her house, when he'd left, despite her admonishments and warnings. The last time he'd ever seen her and the pain he felt after that door shut. He was abandoning her, even if he'd felt that long ago she'd left him for alcohol and depression. It was this futility that plagued Jake in everything in life, including photography. Art offered an escape, but it also provided a challenge unlike anything he'd ever faced, a difficulty that struck soul deep. Jake's art, the rare times he'd shared it, only seemed to make his limitations more pronounced. When someone looked at his photographs, Jake felt like they were looking at him in a way that went beyond a physical or even emotional understanding. It was like standing before God. His soul weighed. Those doubts drove him, kept him staring into his camera or monitor for hours, working relentlessly, retouching a photo until the exact image he wanted was realized. And this despite the very real and extremely likely chance that none of his efforts would amount to anything. Jake didn't use social media, even though it had worked well for other photographers. Something about those platforms seemed poisonous to him, desperate and most damaging, identical to everyone else. Jake didn't like how those sites compressed photos, losing the minute details and heartbreaking colors he savored, the resonance he'd discovered in whatever inspiration had driven him to this particular photo, and that he'd spent days or weeks or, when he'd first started, even months developing. It had started with a book, a collection of black and white photographs from Margaret Burke White he'd found in his high school's library. A photo of African Americans in the early 20th century waiting in line underneath a poster of a beaming white family next to the words, "There's no way like the American way." Even at his young age, Jake found the contrast overstated. But that wasn't what drew him to the photo. It was the expressions of the waiting men and women, resolute and disappointed, a few of them glancing doubtfully at the camera, others glumly staring forward, as if they'd been waiting lifetimes and there was no end in sight. Jake stared at the image for almost the entire lunch hour, noticing small details about each person, the way one man clutched a bucket, the way another stared warily behind himself. Jake returned the next day and wanted to lose himself in the photo again, the way someone might repeatedly listen to a song, but instead he flipped through the book, his hand trembling, and saw Burke White's other photographs. Industrial images hopelessly darkened by gray smoke. Scenes of nature, but as if they'd been taken abruptly and on the verge of nature changing, wilting plants, melting snow. Grim people, often working, toiling with a sense of inescapability and despair. These photos left Jake with so many questions about the subjects and their lives. And, strangely, he felt that if he only examined the photos closer, he'd discover the answers. Jake did have hopes for his own book someday, a long, flat book with protective covers and soft pages and quiet text on the sides or underneath his pictures. Title, date, and location. An introduction by a master of the field in the beginning, an index at the end. A photo of Jake on the back. A self-portrait taken somewhere like Baltimore's Patterson Park, just below the famed Japanese pagoda, Jake smiling with his arms outstretched. He'd never told anyone about this fantasy, even Eric, despite everything his friendship with Eric had given him. Only Eric had understood him, and only Eric had seen most of his work. He wanted to, would look at Jake's photographs with a type of rapt attention and curiosity Jake was too embarrassed to admit he craved. Eric understood Jake's work, and so Eric understood him. And Jake knew what he offered his friend in return. Eric's mother's death had haunted him, his abrupt departure to South Carolina, where he'd grown up after her loss, had left him isolated, the only half-Asian kid in a school, seemingly in the entire state. Jake would listen to Eric's stories, absorb them because somehow, on some distant level, he empathized. The two of them had a relationship they needed and cherished, and Jake had never had anything else like that until he'd met Melissa. She and Eric had liked each other immediately, despite Eric's trepidation about her relationship with Chris Winters and the danger that she brought. He remembered when Melissa and Eric had first met, and the two of them had talked about Jake's photography, about his reluctance to share it. "Don't you ever want to show it?" Melissa had asked. "Wouldn't that make you happy?" He hadn't known how to reply, and so he hadn't. "Jake," she'd said, crestfallen, "don't you think you deserve happiness?" "It's okay," Melissa said now, and, as always, her words burned away whatever bad feelings were inside him. "We'll figure this out." The warmth Jake felt toward her at that moment was like heat seeping through a man who had nearly frozen. He didn't feel dumb or judged, just loved. As if her words had translated that message in the night sky. "What are you smiling at?" Melissa asked. Jake blinked, reality resurfacing. "I was just thinking about how much I love you." "Cute. But do you think we should do something about that angry old guy who has our gun?" "We really should." "Got any ideas?" "I really don't." "Hey!" Harold's voice from inside the warehouse, but close. "I'm coming out!" They stepped away from the window. "He sounds scared," Jake whispered. "He sounds angry," she whispered back. Harold sounded both angry and scared. "I'd better not see either of you." Jake and Melissa moved farther away from the window. "We need to let him go," Jake said quietly. "But we should leave first. Get the car and go." She didn't respond. "Melissa?" "He'll tell people about us," Melissa said. "He knows too much. We can't just let him leave." The resolve in her voice worried Jake. "But what do we do?" he asked. "He has our gun. When he comes outside, you need to flash him." Jake stared at her, then down at his zipper. "Sorry?" "Flash him with the camera, and then we'll grab the gun." "That's crazy," he said, but when he looked at Melissa's face, even in the dark, Jake saw defiance. The commitment to whatever they needed to do next. The same expression just before she'd driven that knife. That was something in her that Jake admired and envied and feared. He saw the fighter inside her, the kind of ancient warrior who would run into battle. She was Achilles standing over Hector, Hannibal staring up at the Alps, Joan of Arc glaring as flames rose. "You'd best not let me see you," Harold said, his voice just on the other side of the window. His fingers appeared on the sill, straining. Jake heard scrabbling on the other side of the wall. Melissa touched Jake's arm. Harold's head appeared next, his eyes wide and wild behind his glasses, peering vainly. More scrabbling, and his upper body suddenly filled the window, leaning awkwardly, his arms flailing for balance. No gun in sight. "Jake," Melissa urged him. Harold landed with a thud on the ground, rolled to his back and panted. Melissa took a step toward him. Harold reached behind himself, whipped out the gun, pulled himself up and sat against the wall and wheezed. Melissa looked back at Jake. He knew what she wanted, but couldn't bring himself to lift the camera. Jake tried to tell himself it was because of Harold's gun, that he couldn't risk Melissa getting shot. And that was part of it, but not all of it. The truth was, he couldn't welcome violence. This was the passivity within himself Jake often resented, timidity and cowardice. It was why he'd lain still as Chris knelt over him, pummeling him. Jake's own fear of striking back, of provoking an even greater anger. Don't you think you deserve happiness? There are people looking for us, Melissa told Harold urgently. If they find out we're here, they'll come for us and kill everyone in their way. You can't tell anyone about us, Harold. So what were you planning to do here? Harold asked, and Jake thought this was a fair question. Keep me here forever? Kill me when you figure out your next move? We didn't know what to do, Melissa said. I won't tell anyone, Harold said intently. No one. He tried to lift himself up and grunted, slipped back down, the gun in the dirt. Melissa looked back at Jake, and there was something in her expression that finally spurred him to act. Not the defiance he saw earlier. It was the opposite. A moment of pity, of knowing he was incapable of helping. Jake lifted the camera, and the world was suddenly on fire. The flash was so sudden and bright that, even though Jake knew it was coming, he was still blinded. It was more than a light and darkness. It was an X-ray showing Harold's surprise, his eyes and mouth wide. Melissa in slow motion, running toward him, reaching out. Jake following her, unsure what he was doing. And then he slipped, and his face was pressed against Harold's chest, buried against his shirt, Jake's shoes helplessly digging into the dirt, his left knee wet from the ground. Melissa shouting something Jake didn't understand, Harold screaming like a siren, the same sound over and over. The camera flashed again and again. Spots of light like winking stars. Jake's hands covered Harold's. The gun swung toward Melissa and she stared at it, frozen, like this was fate. Strength. Mystical strength. Jake bent the other man's will, bent the will of nature itself, as the gun pointed away from Melissa and pressed between their bodies. Please, Jake said, his cheek against Harold's forehead. Harold still screaming, Jake kneeling above him. The gunshot sounded like splintering wood. Chapter 8. Lucky. Nice to see you again, Lucky said. Your son's about to die. Can I come in? Ruby Smith stared at him from her doorway. Jake? She asked. It was just one word, but it was enough to remind Lucky of the hitch in Ruby Smith's voice, the way a single sound stretched into a pair of syllables. Yes. Lucky glanced up and down the street. Ruby lived in a rambler, and the houses were spread apart, separated by long lawns and lines of trees. Within the triangle of D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, houses and businesses were in close proximity, and concrete was everywhere, developers overtaking nature. Here, on the outskirts of Winchester, Virginia, just an hour away from D.C., it was the opposite. Distant mountains were like storm clouds. Roads disappeared into woods. The air held a slow quiet. You'd better come in, Ruby said. Lucky followed her inside, closed the door behind himself. The entrance led immediately into the living room, a squat couch in front of a muted television showing Wheel of Fortune, doors leading to other rooms. A painting of Jesus on the wall, long brown hair and demure eyes, hand over his heart. Very little resale value, which was a shame because outlying towns like Winchester were growing in popularity, spurred by the revolution in remote work and families taking the opportunity to find safer communities with lower costs of living. But any family interested in this aged house would be better served by tearing it down, building on ashes. Ruby sat on the couch. Who's looking for Jake? The cops? Not just the cops. You too? Yes. Ruby's shoulders slumped. Lucky intently studied her without appearing like he was intently studying her. He couldn't read anything in his old friend's face. Of all the people to get involved with, Ruby sighed. You'd think he'd know better. You'd think we all would. She grunted in reply. Lucky hadn't seen or spoken to Ruby for years, but there was something in her that hadn't changed. Violence underneath a placid surface. A shark about to erupt from calm waters. This, even despite her sadness, the way everything about Ruby was resigned. Her squarish stomach, slumped shoulders, small blue eyes, unbrushed, dyed orange hair. Did you hear about that mess at the diner the other night? Lucky went on. Over in Maryland? A shrug. Lucky wasn't surprised. The story had already disappeared from the media, stolen by the Winterses, or lost in the news cycle.
This is the end of disc number 2. Please insert disc number 3. This is disc number 3.
The paper said a guy named Bruce Parks was after 2 people. Not sure if you remember him from your time. A pair of customers got shot and killed, and 2 people escaped and are on the run. That was Jake and this girl, Melissa. Ruby took a slow breath before she spoke again. But Jake's okay. So far. Lucky wasn't supposed to meet Ruby back when they worked together. She was just the voice on the phone, telling him about jobs, giving details and clues. But there came a night when Lucky was sitting in his car waiting for the lights to go off in a house across the street, and someone rapped on the passenger side window. He lowered the window. This is the wrong house, Ruby had told him. I wish you'd told me that 5 minutes ago. Even in the night, he saw her pale. Kidding. Relief took her over. She smiled. The job was postponed, and she had sat with him in his car, and they talked. Their encounter and the ensuing conversation was probably against some rule the Winterses had, and they indulged in the illicit experience. An hour passed and easily could have slipped into 2, but when a neighbor walking a dog stared at Lucky's car, they decided it was time to leave. And their friendship remained even after Ruby left the Winterses. Repentance for her actions had left Ruby desperate to disappear, to change her appearance and name and address, to move to a different city. Lucky had helped her hide, found the house in Winchester for her and her young son. He kept an eye out, and, eventually, the Winterses stopped searching. You look exactly the same, Ruby said. Lucky hadn't realized she was examining him as well. But Ruby never missed anything. Those small, scanning eyes. How's Mary Beth? Almost done with high school, right? Almost. A small smile. How are you handling that? Barely. Ruby squinted past Lucky at the television set behind him, slid over on the couch to the end table, picked up the remote, and turned it off. Lucky stayed still. So I take it you're still doing the family man thing? She asked. Selling houses during the day, working for the Winterses at night? Why? Is Kim Flowers looking to sell? You remember. I should. I was the one who came up with your new name. Ruby's elbow perched on the edge of the couch, her hand dangling near the drawer of an end table. We had some good times, Ruby said. It'd be a shame to ruin those memories by going for the gun in that drawer. Ruby glanced at the end table as if surprised. You think there's a gun in here? I do. There isn't. Lucky had already calculated the distance, knew he'd made an error. There was no chance he could reach the table before she pulled out the gun, even if Ruby was half as fast as she used to be. He'd be better served by running through the doorway to his left. He wasn't sure where it led, but at least it'd give him time to pull his own weapon. This doesn't have to go the way you're thinking, Ruby said. Then why's your hand next to that table? To distract you. Ruby pulled out a small pistol from between the couch cushions with her other hand. Told you nothing was in the drawer, she said. Now tell me about my son. Oh, Jake, Ruby sighed. She was sitting opposite Lucky at her small, round kitchen table. Chipped white cupboards over laminate countertops and a linoleum floor. Lucky considered outdated kitchens an almost personal affront, but he kept his annoyance inside. His desire to replace the counters and appliances and entirely remove the walls separating the kitchen from the dining room. Instead, he distracted himself by looking out the window into a square backyard of splotchy grass and dirt. Ruby's gun was on the table between them, but closer to her. It was always going to be some girl, she told him. You know, I used to get jealous of them. The girls, I mean. They'd come over and Jake was so naive, and girls grow up so much faster. I knew what they were doing, what they wanted. Her voice turned bitter. He had no idea, of course. Boys are so blind. Then they grow up into stupid men. Lucky didn't necessarily disagree. You never met Melissa? He asked. Ruby shook her head. I haven't seen Jake in years. We got into an awful fight and he left. You were drinking back then? She regarded him evenly. I was. What about now? It's been 809 days, but who's counting? Where are you working? She unscrewed the top of a plastic bottle of water, took a drink. With a pair of bankruptcy attorneys over in town. You're a lawyer? Office manager. Ruby frowned at him. You don't seem like yourself, Lucky. He felt like he couldn't hide a thing from her. Family ages a person, he offered. Want to talk about it? Lucky was tempted, but he worried emotion would again overwhelm him. I came here to tell you that your son is being hunted down, and you're asking me about my marriage? I didn't say your marriage. A half smile. I guess I can't help it. It's what I do now. Help people. I have found the Lord. Oh no. Are you going to ask me to pray with you? Do you want me to pray with you? No. Then I won't, Ruby said easily. The thing with the Lord, Lucky, is that we can only help people who want help. It's like the bankruptcy office. If people don't walk through the door, then we can't do anything for them. Lucky thought about what Ruby was saying, remembered breaking down the day before in front of Chris Winters and Marley. Who do you think killed Victor Winters? Lucky asked. The devil struck him down. I'd say you're looking in the wrong direction. There's only one direction, Ruby replied. There is a Lord, and he is God, and he is the devil, and he is us. And we are sin, and we are blessed. Lucky thought for a moment. I'm not following any of that. And you couldn't. It is beyond our comprehension. You don't want to just say, maybe it was some other bad guys who killed Victor? Whatever killed Victor Winters had a power that went beyond bad or humanity, even his own reaches. The only thing that could have killed Victor was something belonging to death. Assassins more dangerous than anyone we know. Ruby's words and steady gaze shook something in Lucky, and he had a distinct urge to stand and leave and return home, ensconced within family. But there was no peace with his family. Not with Renee working at her school right now, William McKenna teaching some class down the hall from the administrator office. Renee walking down the hall, glancing through the window of his classroom door. William looking back, and the two of them meeting eyes and smiling. Department meetings where they sat at the same crowded table, maybe occasionally next to each other, their legs pressed together without anyone's knowledge. Sudden dalliances in her office, The door closing and him sweeping her up in a rough, quick kiss or more. Renee fixing her hair and adjusting her clothes after he left, that flushed excitement in her cheeks. Lucky. Ruby's gun was aimed at him. Lucky had been reaching into his pocket, but stopped. I'm just getting my phone. Stand up and let me watch you do it. He stood slowly, reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone. Ruby lowered her arm. Lucky opened watchful and checked the camera outside William McKenna's house. He hadn't received a notification, but had a distinct feeling, one of those moments of sudden instinct or superstition, that he would see Renee's car parked outside. The driveway was empty. He slipped his phone back inside, sat down. I'm surprised you still have the gun I gave you. Why? Ruby set the gun back on the table, close to her. Because Jesus? A shadow passed through those piercing blue eyes. There's a bar down the street, Ruby said. Right around the corner. I drive past it every day to and from work, and I always look at it. Always. I look at the entrance and I think about how I didn't go in and how some days I want to. Some days I come here and it's just me and my memory, and that bar is around the corner, and nothing's lonelier than that. Sounds like you need a move. We should do something about this kitchen, though. But what helps me, Ruby went on as if Lucky hadn't spoken, is what's around the corner on the other side of the street. A church. Sometimes at the beginning, I'd go there crying, almost crawling every single night. That's a place I'd go when I wanted a drink, when I was alone. One addiction traded for another. Maybe, Ruby agreed. You're probably right, and I could probably do something about that. See a shrink who figures out why I'm so needy and sad. But you and I both know there's no way I can tell anyone what plagues me. Lucky didn't say anything. Ruby just watched him. He looked out the window, at the weeds in her backyard. I'm going to find Jake, he told her. Or someone else is. It's not just me looking. I know. He and this girl aren't going to make it. Is that what you want? It doesn't matter what I want. Ruby took another sip of water. It's been a long time since he made his choice. What choice? Jake doesn't want to come home, Lucky. He's not going to walk through that door. I told you, I can't help someone who doesn't want help. On the way to his house, Lucky almost hit a deer, a dark shape that suddenly bounded in front of his car and frantically raced into the woods. His neighborhood in Annandale was full of wildlife. Deer and foxes and squirrels and raccoons. The deer in particular swarmed the neighborhood in spring, and then hunters were hired by the city to kill them, armed with bows and crossbows to avoid the sounds of gunfire ringing through the woods. Sometimes Lucky would take walks at night or early in the morning and see the hunters perched in trees, steam rising from a drink as they waited. He pulled his black Jeep Grand Cherokee into his garage, checked both phones. No calls on either. He walked into an argument between his wife and daughter. I don't really care. Renee's voice had reached a pitch Lucky knew well, a point beyond compromise. You're not going. But Mom, Mary Beth pressed. I'm telling you about it. What the hell? Do not talk to me that way. Lucky strolled into the kitchen and the two women started talking to him at the same time. Renee angry, Mary Beth indignant. Mom's not letting me go to a party next weekend, Mary Beth said. Even though I told her about it and my friends are going. The boy she likes is there, Renee said. And he's older. How much older? Lucky asked. He looked at Mary Beth, not Renee. Lucky desperately wanted to look at Renee to see if there was anything to catch in her expression, The utter hypocrisy of forbidding their daughter from an illicit relationship. But anger and sadness prevented him. "Does it matter?" Mary Beth asked. "He's not in high school, and that's what Mom's freaking out about." "It's not okay," Renee said tersely. "Him being older makes him more responsible than high school boys." Despite everything, Lucky couldn't help laughing at that. Renee joined in. "You can't date an older guy," Lucky said. "But he understands me." Every word from Mary Beth was like it was being wrung out, forced from some torturous depths. "Not like boys in high school." "It's a no," Renee said. "But Dad—" "God damn it, stop!" Lucky's tone silenced the room like a smack. Both women flinched as if this was something they were used to, or something they had dreaded. Mary Beth rushed out of the kitchen, up the stairs, slammed her bedroom door. "That was a little harsh," Renee commented. Lucky walked over to the fridge, popped open a can of Coke, felt the acid bubbling down his throat. His insides were shaky, and he wasn't sure caffeine was the best idea, but he felt uncertain, directionless, a need to do something without a clear idea of what exactly that thing was. It reminded him of the first person he'd been paid to kill. How, afterward, when the man was lying on his bedroom floor, bleeding from a bullet hole that had sloppily landed on the side of his head, Lucky had walked around the house, glanced into the rooms, gone to his kitchen. Nice. Stainless steel, marble. Turned on the television and stared blankly at house hunters. "I don't know how we can stop her," Renee was saying. "She asked to go to this party even though we just talked with her about this. Can you believe that?" "She'll find a way. Liars always do." A pause in the conversation. "Is everything okay with you?" Renee asked. Lucky heard fear in her voice. Or maybe guilt. He pulled out his phone, opened watchful. "How was work?" "Fine." Lucky stared at the front of William's house, the doorway faintly illuminated by a street lamp. If Renee took a step toward him, one single small step, she'd see the image. And everything would change in that one moment, the curtain flung aside, the book skipped ahead to the last page. But he wasn't ready for that. "Lucky?" Lucky was lost, imagining himself walking to William's doorstep, ringing the bell. Pulling William out, dragging him into the night. One hand over his mouth, the other digging a knife into the side of his neck. Working the knife like a corkscrew. "Lucky?" Renee asked again. This was where Lucky's path was going, toward that house. To confronting and killing William. There was no peace otherwise, and it would never be found until he went through that door. "Look what I have," Renee said, and she held a magazine out to him. "I went ahead and opened your special package." Lucky closed his phone and took the magazine from her. Stared down at the cover of the annual Lee Max Christmas Village catalog. This year's cover photo was impossibly bright and cozy, a warm brown blanket draped over a red recliner, blurred orange flames from a fireplace. And in front of this pleasantly designed nostalgia were small houses and shops, this year's newest additions to their Christmas village. A tiny coffee shop and dog grooming salon, a cupcake store with an illuminated baker in the window, figurines of children and parents strolling through, a tiny train wrapped around the town. "I know you like to open it yourself," Renee said, happiness in her voice. "But your face is really cute when you first see it. I wanted to be there." Lucky was already on page 6. "They have a truffle factory this year, with a little moving conveyor belt." "Mary Beth and I saw that. You should get it." Every year, Lucky and Renee and Mary Beth spent an entire weekend in early December decorating the house for Christmas. His wife and daughter would place ornaments on the tree, Renee carefully unwrapping each one and remarking on when and where they'd first obtained it, while Mary Beth hung tinsel and candy canes. Lucky, of course, was in charge of the village, and it had grown in size to occupy both their fireplace hearth and their living room table, like two neighboring towns. There was a certain precision to the village that Lucky enjoyed, everything from where the houses intersected with the stores to the placement of the trees and signs. And the lights were similarly planned, so that when the living room lamps were off, the entire village was lovingly illuminated. Sometimes Lucky would sit in the darkness and stare at the village, the way the light pressed the shadows away. He knew better than most how romanticized this idea was, how unrealistic, how likely it was that a scene such as this had never lasted longer than a moment. But that was what he loved about it, this captured happiness, this tender, glowing image. "We're decorating some more this weekend, right?" Renee asked. Her voice brought him back. Lucky closed the catalog gently. "Maybe," he said. "I might have work." He'd look through the catalog later, read every description and caption, study each joyful image. But first, he had to find Jake and Melissa. He had another lead. And after he found Jake and Melissa, Lucky wanted to murder William as brutally as possible. Then he and Renee and Mary Beth could get back to decorating. Lucky headed out to his backyard office to research his new lead. He still hadn't looked at Renee's face. Chapter 9. Ruby. Lucky had left, but his message remained. Ruby sat at her kitchen table and bit her thumbnail. What she'd started to suspect was true. She'd sent assassins after her own son. She'd ordered Jake's murder. Ruby had always been able to find some sort of distance between herself and her errors. And when her conscience refused to allow her remorse, she'd turn to the Lord. But at the thought of Jake, a terrible darkness welled. Ruby needed to think, to clear her head, to leave this silent house empty except for her memories of Jake, those moments she savored. She asleep at the table or on the couch or in bed, his timid, "Mom?" This house a silent companion, watchful and unspeaking. Ruby abruptly stood, grabbed her handbag and keys. She hurried down the road, hands clenching and unclenching, wondering if it was exertion that was causing her to breathe hard as she walked. She didn't know where she was going and was surprised to find herself, after 2 blocks, behind the liquor store. Ruby had no idea what had brought her here, what she was doing in this clean little alley, as if someone from the Winterses would be here. Joe returned with another message and a few minutes of conversation, Frank watching her through his yellow glasses. And if either of them were miraculously there and waiting for her, Ruby would fall on her knees before these figures who could save Jake with a few well-placed words, kings whose casual decisions shaped or slaughtered lives. "Give me your message," Ruby would tell them, "and I will pass it to the world. I only ask for this." But there was no one there, the alley quiet. Ruby wanted to scream, to run and find someone who could help her, a stranger she could beg to save her son. She hadn't felt such utter helplessness since Jake left her, walked out of their home that summer after finishing high school, after he'd learned the truth of who she was, learned what she had done. Ruby's mind frantically cast back, the way it had that night after Jake slammed the front door, after she'd confessed the truth about Tiffany, a truth her son couldn't accept, even if it was a secret he was willing to keep. And then her mind went further back to her father, the failure father, the meek man she barely remembered, who had been unable to control her raging, alcoholic mom, who spent most of his time at his job and was home in the evenings, timidly entering the apartment after Ruby's mother was passed out, and quietly preparing a dinner for himself and eating alone in the kitchen, his thin body huddled as if anticipating a blow. Ruby had so hated his weakness that she was surprised when he simply disappeared one day when she was 7, surprised he'd even had the strength to leave. She'd lain sideways on the floor of the living room and watched The Price is Right while her drunk mother screamed and smashed glasses in the kitchen. That led to the darkest times, months of her mother drinking beyond reason, sitting curled on a chair on the couch, a blanket over her, crying, missing so much work Ruby thought she must have lost her job at the call center. And then there was Ray. At first, Ruby thought he was just one of the men her mother had started bringing home. Her mother, dreamy-eyed and demure, laughing too loud at everything he said, touching his arm constantly, glaring red-painted lips, her voice too slurred to be seductive. Ruby didn't expect to see Ray again, but he returned a couple of nights later, her mother leading him proudly through the door, as if excited to prove to her 9-year-old daughter that this was more than a one-night stand. He kept returning. Ruby was diffident toward him in the way she was with all the men her mother brought home. Some of the men stared at Ruby in a way that made her uncomfortable, and she felt like she could sense their gaze through the wall between her bedroom and her mother's, and she would lock her door. Ray was different. He was friendly to her, but not overly friendly, not like he was luring her. He crouched on the floor opposite her, commented on the castle she was coloring. "I could color better than that," Ray said. "No, you couldn't," Ruby replied. He grinned, stood when her mother grasped his arm and pulled him to the bedroom. Ray started coming by during the days, would bring a sandwich and chocolate milk for Ruby whenever he stopped in. He'd sit on the floor while she sat on the couch, the two of them laughing at cartoons while her mother slept in her bedroom. Ruby noticed that her mother stopped bringing over other men. It was just Ray. Ruby liked that. She carefully watched her mother with him, the way she flirted and said things designed to have Ray react in the ways she wanted, and Ruby realized something disquieting. She and her mother liked the same thing about Ray. There was something withdrawn about him, reclusive. He had a secret. That secret drew them to him, moths fluttering around a light. And she felt the same happiness her mother did when Ray started moving in, the night he showed up with a pair of duffel bags, one in each hand, answering Ruby's questioning glance with, "Might as well keep some clothes here, right?" Her mother jumped and clapped her hands. Ruby felt the same happiness, although she restrained a smile. Ruby didn't want to let herself grow too attached. She knew the devil inside her mother would soon emerge, rip through her body, and turn her into the violent, profane creature that had made her father cower. And it did, a few nights after Ray brought those bags. Ruby could sense it emerging as the three of them ate dinner in front of the television, her mother growing quiet during Wheel of Fortune, her lips small and narrowing. The tension in Ruby's back felt like it was going to snap her spine in half, and she was almost relieved when her mother abruptly stood, knocking her TV tray to the floor. But Ray stood up as well, fast as a striking snake, a finger in her mother's face. "Pick that up," he said, his voice cement, "and sit down." To Ruby's astonishment, her mother did, as meekly as her father used to. Knelt on the floor and picked up the spilled food, carried it to the kitchen, returned and sat on the couch, tears on her face, but quiet. This was a new side to her mother, one Ruby had never seen. But the devil still emerged when she and Ruby were alone. Then her mother was worse than she'd ever been, as if she'd held her anger somewhere deep inside and finally allowed it to erupt. That was when she started hitting and kicking Ruby in places Ray would never see. Ruby's stomach and back and thighs. And when Ray returned and Ruby's body ached, she hid her pain. didn't want to risk Ray leaving, losing the side of her mother that only he was able to bring out. Ruby could only remember one time when her mother stood up to Ray. Once when Ruby was moving his jacket from the table and she saw a gun underneath it. "Whoops," Ray told her, but he didn't seem alarmed. "That yours?" He nodded. "Want to hold it?" he asked. "Okay." Ruby had just touched the gun, the textured rubber grip, when she heard her mom's voice. "Ruby!" Ruby's hand shot back as if she'd been stung. Her mother marched into the room, picked up the gun, handed it to Ray. "Maybe when you're older," he said easily. Ruby was never entirely sure, as years passed, if her mother and Ray had married. At times they called each other husband and wife, often in a playfully exasperating tone, but Ruby never saw any evidence of a wedding, even a quick one. And Ray never fully lived with them. He was there a lot, but the house seemed more like a temporary base for him, a second life away from some other one. Ruby was sure that other life had to do with his gun. And so, when she learned the truth, that terrible night she and her mother rushed to the hospital after Ray had been shot, the weeks after he'd come home from the hospital in a wheelchair, and told 16-year-old Ruby who he worked for and what he'd done, and how he and his men had lost some street war, Ruby wasn't entirely surprised by the revelation. He was crying, shattered, hitting his limp legs over and over as they dangled off his chair, her mother ashen and terrified. "No one's coming after me!" he shouted at her mother after she'd asked over and over if she was in danger, implored him for the truth. But Ruby stayed awake that night, holding his gun in the closet by the front door, waiting for men to enter their apartment. An unseen danger, a power she'd never encountered, had ripped through their tiny apartment like a tornado, torn apart the base supporting their family. Ruby was used to her mother's rage, understood its parameters. But this was something different, dangerous, outside the realm of her imagination, something she could only understand through an otherworldly lens. Something she could only hope to fight back with the power of a gun, that instantaneous way guns had of suddenly ending or forever altering the course of a life. Sitting in that dark closet, Ruby felt safer the tighter she gripped the handle. Ray was right. No one came, and this only seemed to dispirit him further. He wasn't in danger of going to jail or facing reprisal. Ray was forgotten, spending days and nights sitting in front of the television, morosely wheeling himself to the kitchen and bathroom. Sometimes Ruby would sit with him, watching whatever he wanted. Sometimes she would realize he was crying, and she would join him, the two of them indulging in depression while her mother drank or slept in the bedroom. It was strange to Ruby how natural this depression seemed. She didn't even necessarily feel sad about anything in particular. It was just a familiar sense of dejection, like a coat she put on, winter after winter. Her mother was the one who found Ray's body later that year, the gun in his hand and a hole in the back of his head, slumped off his wheelchair, his body blocking the bathroom door. She didn't seem, to Ruby, particularly sad. Whatever hold Ray had had on her was gone, as if now that he was unable to take care of her in the way she needed, they had nothing left. There was an odd strength that, in some disquieting way, Ruby understood. When Ruby thought about Ray, she remembered who he had been, his cheerful confidence as he sauntered into their apartment, the way he'd kept the devil and her mother at bay, the way his secret sustained him until it was revealed. And this unseen force that had crippled and then killed him, overthrown the natural order of the world with a gesture. Like a stone blocking the entrance of a cave shoved to the side, and what emerged was both true and incomprehensible, terrified witnesses falling to their knees, unable to rise as it stood before them. Ruby stood uncertainly between the liquor store and the church and couldn't go to either. Knew she wouldn't find refuge in a bottle or a pew. Neither would save her son. She didn't even have a way to contact the Winterses. All she ever received from them were burner phones with a few saved numbers and messages to remember. And the people she called were the ones with orders to kill. Yes, she had been the one to tell them, but the messages came from someplace higher, and if the Winterses knew her relation to Jake, then there was the chance they would use her to get to him. And her death wouldn't save his life. She couldn't turn to Lucky, not after she'd deceived him for so long, even though he'd helped Ruby when she'd decided to leave the Winterses, and Lucky had found a new home and life for her and Jake. And then the Winterses had found her. She'd thought Lucky had given her up, revealed her new location, but he hadn't. The men who came to her house one morning when Jake was at school told her how they'd found her, a camera at a gas station. And Ruby didn't reveal that Lucky had helped her attempt to leave. The men offered death to her and Jake, and Ruby begged to return instead, and somehow they accepted her offer. They gave her mercy, and because of that she wholly gave herself, tempering any regrets with alcohol. She never told Lucky she was back, never betrayed that sense of hope he had that, perhaps, there was another life to which he could return. Sometimes he would check in on her, and Ruby never confessed that she hadn't escaped. And when Jake left her and she left alcohol, Ruby found something else to turn toward, a church where she learned about a God who had struck down his enemies, who had drowned a world, and in this God, Ruby understood everything she had ever witnessed. There is the Lord, and he is God, and he is the devil, and he is us, and we are sin, and we are blessed, and she was his voice. Evening was setting over Winchester, and the nights here were blacker than Ruby had ever experienced when she'd lived in Alexandria, the way that city's array of lights had silenced the stars. Ruby trudged back home. Her nails bit into her palms as she desperately tried to figure out how she could save her son, wondering if she even should, until she felt a trickle of blood over her fingers. Her phone buzzed. Ruby stopped walking, slowly pulled it out of her pocket, worried about what she would be told. Wharfside. One single word spoken by a voice she didn't recognize, but she understood the message. Jake and Melissa were in the town of Wharfside. That was what she needed to convey to the assassins, to Lucky and the others. But with that information, Ruby understood there was a path ahead. There is the Lord, and he is God, and he is the devil, and he is us. She pressed her bloody palms together in plan and prayer. Chapter 10. Melissa. Morning came when Harold had finally stopped moaning and fell asleep. Melissa had cleaned his wound with bottled water, used a pair of shears Jake had found to cut away the cloth from Harold's pants, tied and loosened a tourniquet throughout the night, all advice she and Jake had hurriedly read on their phones. Now she stared intently at the bullet wound just above his knee. It was still a mess of torn skin and bone fragments, but the wound had dried. Melissa sat back heavily. Harold was going to live. She hoped so, anyway. Jake had been a panicked mess after they'd lifted Harold up and pushed him back through the window, Harold dropping inside the warehouse with a thud and a shriek. Jake and Melissa had dragged him back to the yacht and its lanterns, but Jake was unable to stop his hands from shaking as they tried to treat the older man. Eventually, Melissa had asked him to hold Harold down. "It wasn't your fault," Melissa had told him over Harold's moans. "He shot himself. We should have just let him go." His words were too mired and self-loathing to sound like an accusation. Besides, regardless of what had happened, even if Harold had died, Melissa knew letting him leave would have been a mistake. She knew that as firmly as Jake believed the opposite. And that impasse between her and Jake was apparent, even if unspoken. Their silence grew so thick it felt like a living thing between them. Eventually, Jake had stalked off. She'd let him go, staring down at Harold, wiping sweat away from his face, and had an odd thought. Was she acting like Chris and had Jake assumed her role? Melissa remembered Chris perched over Jake, his fists thundering down, and the horror that had filled her. A horror at the shine in Chris, the luster in his anger. And yet somehow she'd understood his actions. Not that she agreed with them, just that she expected them in the way that a child awaits punishment. This was the order of the world she'd lived in for so long. And now Melissa realized she hadn't emerged from it unscathed. Her perspective seemed ruined, but necessary. The way her immediate impulse had been to shoot Harold when she'd looked down from the deck and seen Jake standing behind him. That brief hope in her during their struggle outside the warehouse that the gunshot had killed him. How even now, treating him alone, she thought about slipping into the yacht and returning with a pillow, pressing it over Harold's face until his arms and legs stopped flailing. She poured water on a paper towel, ran it over the blood on Harold's leg, careful not to press down on the wound. Melissa had made her choice between Chris and Jake, between violence and retreat, but it was a choice she would need to keep making. "Hey," Harold said weakly. He didn't try to move from his supine position, lying down with his hand suspended as if waiting for someone to high-five him. "Where's your man?" he asked. Out. Melissa ran a hand through her hair, already starting to feel where it was coarsening due to days without washing. Harold wiped his face with his free sleeve. "My leg hurts. Can you call me a doctor?" "I can't." "Okay," Harold said quietly, resigned. "Are you in a lot of pain?" He nodded. Melissa bent over him, touched his forehead. "You're really hot," she said. "Maybe it's infected." "There's a store up the way," Harold told her. "A mile away, straight up River Bend. They sell some medicine stuff." "That little convenience store?" Melissa thought back to the clerk who had hit on her. "I was there yesterday." "Want me to go?" Jake asked, and Melissa turned, saw him behind her. He lifted his camera and snapped a picture of Harold. "I'm not going to smile," Harold said grimly, and Jake laughed. Jake seemed sure of himself, his confidence returning now that Harold was awake and showing resiliency. "I'm sorry," Jake told her. "Why?" "I should have trusted you," he said. "Shouldn't have waited to flash him." "What?" Harold asked. "It's okay," Melissa replied. "We're figuring this out." "And we'll be okay." There was something contagious in Jake's confidence, hope and happiness stronger than she'd ever felt. "You got a good photo, didn't you?" she guessed. "I got a great photo. Those tree branches in the sky, like ancient writing." Warmth touched her chest. Love. Melissa couldn't help it. She'd make this choice over and over until the end of time. "Will you two stop staring at each other?" Harold asked. "And get me some damn medicine." The walk to the store seemed shorter than it had yesterday, but today Melissa walked with urgency. She'd looked up infections, learned that fevers were a worrisome sign. And Melissa didn't have the tools or expertise to treat Harold and didn't trust the articles she'd read online to provide guidance. He needed true medical attention. And to get that medical attention, they needed to leave. Drive at least a state away and take Harold to a hospital. She didn't know if doctors would realize his wound came from a bullet, but she knew all gun injuries had to be reported to the police. The only other option was to leave Harold to die. She couldn't trust him. He'd already promised Melissa and Jake whatever they wanted, promised to keep them a secret, agreed to hide whatever he knew. But what if he didn't? Melissa knew that even the most innocent gossip could lead the Winterses to them. Chris used to boast how easily they found people who ran. Melissa had always wondered if that was a warning. She imagined Harold slowly dying in the warehouse, calling for help, hoping his voice carried through that open window, praying someone happened to be walking by outside. The stark realization that no one was coming to save him, that Melissa and Jake had abandoned him. Tied to that metal ring, unable to free himself as hunger and thirst approached. Melissa reached the store and hurried inside, grateful for the warmth after her walk through the December morning chill. She wandered through the aisles, glancing over snacks and automobile supplies, until she reached a row with medicine. There wasn't much, certainly not as much as she'd hoped. Small containers of Tylenol and aspirin, toothbrushes and floss and mouthwash and condoms and Band-Aids. A single dusty brown bottle of peroxide. Melissa grabbed the bottle and a package of Tylenol. She thought of a lie to tell in case the clerk questioned her about the purchase. Her friend had cut himself during a fishing accident, a harmless cut, but they needed to be careful. Maybe change the male friend to a female to distance Jake's identity even further. She and some friends were in town for a lazy girls' trip. Not that she could ever imagine coming to Wharfside in December with her friends. She set the medicine on the counter. The clerk wasn't here. Melissa hadn't seen him when she'd entered the store, but had assumed he was in one of the aisles sorting items. Or maybe in the office, or storage room, or bathroom, or whatever room she could see behind the counter, that door halfway open. "Hello?" she called. There wasn't an answer. A sensation seized Melissa, something terribly wrong. "Hello?" she said again, her voice quieter. No response. The half-open door behind the counter. "Hello?" Again, nothing. She walked behind the counter, slowly pushed the door all the way open, peeked inside. It was a small square bathroom with white tiles on the floor and a toilet and a sink. A paper towel dispenser hung next to the door. A guide to washing hands on the opposite wall. The dead clerk in the corner, legs splayed. There was such horror on his face. Melissa was standing in his blood. Chapter 11. Lucky. "But you don't know for sure your wife is seeing him," Heather Anders told Lucky. She shifted under the zip ties binding her to the folding lawn chair Lucky had found in the Anderses' garage. She wore pajamas, thin shorts, and a matching top, and the shorts had risen high on her thighs when Lucky had tied her down. He'd realized her fear when she struggled, how she pressed her legs together, and he'd placed a blanket over her lap. Not that a blanket brought much comfort when you're woken by a stranger with a gun, separated from your husband, zip-tied and blindfolded. And then asked to counsel the man who'd kidnapped you. Lucky knew all this, but he couldn't pass up the opportunity to talk with a trained mental health professional. "I saw her car parked in front of his house," he said. "I saw her go inside." "Can you loosen these ropes?" Heather tried again to adjust her position. "They're cutting into me." "They're zip ties, not ropes," Lucky said from his spot on the floor. He lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about his wife and William. Much of his worry, he knew, was based solely on suspicion. But he'd built his life around suspicion. He explained that to Heather and played with the ski mask in his hands. Lucky rarely wore the mask, found it tended to creep up and block his vision. He'd immediately taken it off after blindfolding Heather and her husband. "I just think," Heather told him, "you might be imagining something worse than what's actually happening." "Really?" It's hard to give a diagnosis right now, but sure. There was something about Heather that Lucky liked. She'd been scared, of course, when he'd woken her and her husband at gunpoint, when Lucky forced her husband to bind and blindfold her. The heartbreaking way she'd cried out, "Bill!" when Lucky'd led him to a different room to question each of them about the shootout at the diner. Bill and Heather Anders had been there that evening, according to the article. I'll never forget any of this, local resident Heather Anders stated. Never. Lucky had seen her series of framed degrees on the staircase when he'd broken into the Anderses' modest colonial, each degree rising in level as he ascended the steps from the tasteful living room, dual-tone design, black and white furniture, good square footage, slightly outdated window treatments, until he came across her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Pittsburgh. Lucky hadn't expected to ask her for her advice about his marriage, but he couldn't stop himself. He was just so desperate to soften the lump in his throat. "Do your other patients," he asked, "sometimes imagine things so much that they believe them?" "You're not my patient." "Well..." "But yes," she said. "That can happen, particularly if something is affecting them, like a stressful job." From his back, Lucky tossed the ski mask into the air and caught it. "I've done this for something like 20 years. Why is it affecting me now?" "Obviously, the threat to your marriage, real or perceived, can shake you. But have you experienced any other major life changes?" "I have a daughter," he said carefully. "She's in high school, and she went to a party with older guys. I didn't like that." "Watching your children make their own decisions is hard," Heather said, and then her composure slipped. Urgency filled her voice. "Bill and I have children, 2 girls in college. Their names are Patty and Paula. We love them very much, more than anything in the world." "In college? How old are you?" "I'm 59. Bill's 66. "I thought you were 10 years younger," Lucky said. She shifted under the blanket and he realized the compliment only made Heather more uncomfortable. "Sorry." Lucky sat up gingerly to ease his aching back, changed the subject. "Was it hard, raising your kids, even as a psychologist?" Heather nodded under her blindfold. "That just made it harder. I knew what to expect, but knew I shouldn't always stop it." She took a breath. "It's important that people do the right thing, that people know what the right thing is." "I know!" Lucky clapped his hands. "That's exactly how I feel with my daughter. Like, I need to tell her the right thing, even force her to do it, but I can't, right? You can't stop someone when they really want something." "I think you can," Heather said unsteadily. "I hope so." Lucky frowned. "I think there's a subtext here that's more about the situation you and Bill are in and not about me and my family. Can we focus on me?" Another pause. "Have you always been able to separate your life from your work?" "I've killed people and had dinner with my family an hour later." A sharp intake of breath from Heather. Lucky saw her hands tremble. "But you can't do that anymore?" she asked hopefully. "No, I could. My work isn't cutting into my family. My family's cutting into my work. Like, right now. I should be questioning your husband in the other room, and instead, I'm here with you. He's fine, by the way." Tears streamed from under Heather's blindfold. "He really is fine," Lucky added. "I promise." "Can I see him?" "No." "That makes it very hard for me to help you. Do you understand that? I need you to help me so I can help you." Lucky didn't reply. Heather sighed. "I don't think you can simply say that your work isn't interfering in your marriage," she said. Lucky had noticed that she paused a lot. And he wondered if that was due to the current circumstances or if she was a thoughtful, deliberative speaker. He'd never seen a psychologist before, but imagined this cadence was common. Your work requires deception, Heather went on. You feel that lying to your family is a lie to yourself. It's filling you with self-loathing. There were moments in Lucky's life when a simple answer had been the solution to a complicated question, Occam's gleaming razor. And he realized this was one of those moments. The lid to the box cleanly yanked away, and he was able to behold what had been inside. It was the lies. He couldn't live a life of lies any longer. Perhaps that had been reinforced by Renee's infidelity, but lying to his family now struck him in a way it never had. It was as if the corruption he engaged in was affecting his soul. Lucky stood slowly so as not to strain his back further. I'll be back, he told Heather. He lifted the ball gag from around her neck, placed it gently against her lips, checked the blindfold over her eyes. Strands of her brown hair were caught in it, tugged down. Lucky stepped out of the primary bedroom and into the hall, past a bathroom and headed to the guest room where Heather's husband, Bill, was similarly blindfolded, bound, and gagged. I'm back, Lucky told him and removed the gag. And you're a lucky man. Your wife just gave me an epiphany. Does she help you a lot? Bill didn't respond. Lucky had noticed the other set of framed certificates in the house, these in the guest bedroom, that they'd converted to a small office. The certificates commemorated Bill's achievements in the military and, later, his work with the police force of Frederick, Maryland. Honors for his time in Iraq, promotions and awards for bravery in the line of duty. Sometimes Lucky knew history mattered. Sometimes men had a resume marked by violence and every line of text was a layer of steel. And sometimes that violence just left them broken. It was a good thing, Lucky thought, that he and Bill had Heather to talk to. So, you and Heather were in the Heartbreak Diner during the shooting, Lucky began. You witnessed Melissa Cruz and Jake Smith get into an altercation with Bruce Parks, which led to the deaths of... I told you that I don't know anything about that. Bill's voice was strained. Where's my wife? She's fine, and she'll stay that way if you keep talking. Did you see them leave? Who are you? Did you see them leave? See their car, get the plates? No response from Bill. Unlike Heather, Bill hadn't needed to tamp down his fear. He'd been angry when Lucky had woken him with a gun pressed against his head, scowled and refused to do anything. Until Lucky had pointed his weapon at Heather. Lucky took a knee next to Bill. Heather's fine, and she's going to stay that way if you talk. I don't want to hurt her, but I will. I'll kill you. Lucky nodded. You're saying that because it gives you strength, but the truth is, Bill, you can't stop me from hurting her. Bill flinched like Lucky had struck him. There's only one way to save Heather, Lucky went on. Telling me what I want to know. Lucky's personal phone buzzed. But I need to take this first. He refastened the gag around Bill's mouth, headed to the hallway where he could keep an eye on the rooms Bill and Heather were in. Lucky answered his phone, spoke low. Hello? Hi. The voice sounded familiar, but Lucky couldn't place it. I'm sorry for calling at this hour. Is this Lucky? Yes. Who's this? This is James Forrester. My wife, Jean, and I visited the house on St. Jude the other day. We wanted to know, have you received any offers? Now he recognized the voice. The disinterested couple at the open house, the ones who hadn't even bothered to glance into the basement. Lucky thought back to that couple, tried to remember anything about them, whatever he could use to motivate them. Young, white, church clothes, James in brown shoes and a suit, Jean in a long blue Sunday dress. Huge wedding ring. BMW. Right, Lucky said with enthusiasm and frowned at a wet spot on his sleeve from Bill's saliva. Kidnapping Bill and Heather had gone smoothly until Bill lunged at him and Lucky choked him into unconsciousness. Afterward, Lucky realized he'd strained a muscle on his lower back. Good to hear from you. And yes, it is still on the market. For now. Muffled conversation on the other end of the line before James spoke. Are you available for a showing next Sunday? James asked. What time? Morning? I can do 9 a.m. Lucky cupped his hand over the phone, lowered his voice. And, of course, I'll let you know if I hear from the other party before that. The other party? There may be other interest, Lucky lied. More muffled conversation. Right. Hesitancy in James' voice. Is there any chance you could show it earlier? Lucky thought back to his calendar. He was free, but depending on what information he could pull out of Bill, there was a chance he could be heading even farther out of state to find Jake and Melissa. Saturday at 8? Yes, James said immediately. He and James exchanged pleasantries and goodbyes. You have a second job? Heather asked when he returned to her. Lucky thought back to his phone conversation, tried to remember if he'd said anything revealing. Couldn't think of anything that directly mentioned his identity. But regardless, he was sharing more than he should. A daughter in high school, a weekend business meeting, an adulterous wife. Maybe, he said carefully. Do you think that's part of the reason I'm sad? Depressed. What? You're not sad. You're depressed. Forcefulness in Heather's tone now. What's the difference? Have you ever been this sad before? For weeks? Lucky didn't reply. That's the difference. We all get sad, but depression is different. Depression doesn't fade without treatment. Are you saying, Lucky asked hopefully, you'll treat me? My God, no. A slip in Heather's determination, fear stumbling through. You kidnapped me and my husband, tied us up, and threatened to kill us. It's not the ideal start to our clinical relationship. If you let us live, if you let me and Bill go, I'll make a deal with you. Heather's voice was earnest now, insistent. I'll find help for you. Someone you can talk to. That lump ached in his throat. I think I might like that. It would help you so much, Heather said excitedly. She thought saving him, Lucky realized, would save them. Is Bill really okay? She asked. Can I see him? Soon. The single word sounded foreboding, a hint to death. Lucky thought about correcting himself, but decided to let it stand. Heather's head dropped. I haven't hurt him, Lucky told her. He patted her shoulder. Except when I strangled him into unconsciousness. But that's the only time. Lucky dropped to his knees in front of the bound, blindfolded woman. I have one more question for you, he said intensely. It's about something I saw downstairs. The picture of your daughters. Heather's legs were trembling. Lucky placed his hands on her knees to calm her. Underneath that picture, he said softly, on your fireplace mantel there's a small Lee-Max fire station. Can you tell me where you purchased it? What? The Lee-Max fire station, Lucky went on. It has a Dalmatian looking out through a window, and you can see a fireman's pole inside through the open door. This model was introduced in the late 90s, and I've only seen it online. Once at Putzpo, but I didn't buy it at the time. I don't. Heather, I need you to think. What's Putzpo? Putz Exposition, Lucky clarified. Christmas Village enthusiasts are called putzers, a word that originated from Moravian culture. Putzpo is a convention held every 2 years. I don't know where we got it, Heather told him. I think we found it in a box in my mom's house after she died. You can just take it. Lucky was offended. He removed his hands from her knees. I would never, he told her firmly, take something from someone's home. But those words, take something from someone's home, reminded him again of William. He re-gagged Heather and checked the camera app for William's house. A gray night view of a quiet, empty driveway. Lucky hadn't expected to see Renee's car there, but the fact that it wasn't made him feel better. She'd known he'd be away. Lucky had told her he was looking at a new development in Central Virginia as a potential model for a site up north, and the trip would be overnight, which gave her a chance to see William. Renee wouldn't bring him to the house, not with Mary Beth there, but she could go to his. And she hadn't. Hey, Bill, Lucky said as he entered the office and knelt before the other man and removed his gag. Got anything for me? No. You told me what happened during the shooting, that you'd left your gun at home, but what happened after it was over? I tried to help the wounded, Bill replied grudgingly. But they were already deceased. And you have no idea where Melissa and Jake went? No. You said you and Heather go there all the time, but no other regulars were there that night? No one else you recognized? He didn't answer. Bill, Lucky prodded. We used to go there all the time, Bill said softly. Used to. The small words stopped Lucky, the way the past tense was already assumed. Was it because Bill had heard the diner was going to be closed down after being the site of a double homicide? Was it because Bill and his wife had already decided that they could never revisit it? Or because Bill thought he'd never see his wife alive again? Guilt was a low throb in Lucky's chest, like the echoes of a hammer falling. He wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. We can end this in 2 minutes, Lucky told him decisively. You and Heather will go free. Just tell me something I can use about the diner. Heartbreak Diner was almost empty, Bill said. But I know one of the people there, one who survived. Who? Rodrigo, Bill said quietly. He's a cook. I don't know his last name. Or maybe that is his last name. Bill's shoulders slumped. He shook his head sorrowfully. That's all I know. Lucky couldn't tell if Bill was acting, and he wasn't sure what other information he could gather. Nobody else in the article had been identified by name. Not the other customers, not the investigating officer. Lucky felt like he'd been asked to search a catacomb by candlelight, and all these people, Bill, Heather, Rodrigo, were flickering shadows ahead of him. Then again, there was always the reporter who wrote the story about the diner for the Washington Post. Lucky could question her, find out what she knew, but that was risky. Given Bruce Parks's involvement, there was already a potential connection to the Winterses. Questioning and killing a reporter might initiate a minor investigation, and she'd have to be killed. Unless, Lucky considered, he tried a different approach with a reporter. Pretended to be a journalist for another paper, a small local one. Ask for information about the story, see if she'd be interested in sharing. Lucky knew she might not confirm any of the names of anyone in the diner, but he could get the name of the cop from her. Not that he wanted to go through the police, but Rodrigo the cook wasn't much of a lead. Then again, this route would take longer. A day or two to hear back from the reporter, a day or two to hear back from the cop. And Jake and Melissa could already be a country away by then. Rodrigo is all I have for you, Bill said. I swear it. I believe you, Lucky said, and he pulled out his knife from its sheath around his ankle. Is Heather really okay? Bill asked. Lucky pressed the knife into Bill's hand. Count to 100 and cut yourself free, Lucky told him. Go ahead and call for your wife. Lucky left the bedroom, loosened Heather's gag, heard Bill calling, "Heather!" as he walked down the stairs. Heard Heather calling back. Such relief in their voices, Lucky thought. Such love. Lucky drove for an hour after leaving Bill and Heather Anders. He checked into a motel room just outside D.C., unlocked the door to his room. He lay on the bed and wept. Maybe it was the decrepit room or the unreturned message he'd left with Renee, but Lucky suddenly felt terribly, heartbreakingly lonely. He hadn't felt this alone since the army, Lucky's mind turning to his last days in the service, when he'd stood outside a building in a small village named Arso. The Afghan villagers behind the line of his fellow soldiers, all of them in a heavy silence after the deafening sounds of gunfire. Lucky undressed in the middle of a circle of dumbfounded stares. He was always hot during the day, the sun shining off sand and stone, the dryness in his mouth, the way his lips tightened. He unstrapped his helmet and removed it, ran his hands through the ring of sweat around his head, his wet hair. He was sweating more than he had since his very first patrol months earlier, when he returned to the barracks and found his t-shirt drenched. Lucky let his jacket drop down over the rifle he'd laid on the ground, sat down and untied his boots, the laces that traced up his shins, pulled off his socks and rubbed the soles of his feet into the hot dirt. This entire country was dirt. Closed his eyes and turned his face to the sky. No one said anything. And no one entered the building from which Lucky had emerged, the house where a pair of brothers lived, brothers suspected of sheltering Taliban soldiers. Lucky's unit had come to Arso to interrogate them, found the brothers with their families, the house filled with men, uncles and cousins who'd maintained taut silence while Lucky's patrol questioned them. No answers had been given, and Lucky's patrol had walked out. There was a restlessness in the unit, the emotional preparation for battle, and then that exhausted relief that it hadn't happened. Lucky was tired from the exhaustion, of the suspicious way the Afghans regarded him, the secrets he knew those men were keeping. He'd been the last to leave and the first to return, to steal away from his unit and return to that house, to the quiet defiance. There had been 9 men in that house when he raised his rifle and asked them for information. No one had any, and no one was left alive. Lucky was sent back to the United States and he expected to be placed in a military prison. Instead, he was met at the plane by a large man, bald and white, with hands the size of adult human skulls. That man walked Lucky to a car at the other end of the tarmac. The military police didn't stop them. His name was Victor Winters, and he'd heard that Lucky had a talent for killing and a lack of remorse. And those were 2 traits he valued. He had a proposition for Lucky. Come work for him or go to prison. And so Lucky was under his control, and he remained that way even after Victor's death, nearly 20 years later. But now he was finally close to leaving. Everything inside him wanted to break his cover story and leave this room and hop in his car and drive to his house and climb into bed with Renee and hold her. Fall asleep with her in his arms, her leg draped over his waist, her hair on his shoulder. His phone buzzed, and excitement rushed over him. One of those coincidences that seemed nearly cinematic, a loving answer found in the darkest moment of despair. Renee reaching out to him. But it was the wrong phone. "Lucky Wilson?" One of those faceless female voices from the Winterses. "Yes." "We talked yesterday about a property for sale." "I remember." "I heard one of the other buyers made an offer. Might be near closing." One of the other assassins. They'd found Melissa and Jake. The job was almost over. "Okay," Lucky said. "I understand." The buyers still may be open to other offers, but everyone's having a hard time reaching them. Lucky softly exhaled. They might have found where Melissa and Jake were hiding, but hadn't been able to bring them in. "I can try," Lucky said. "What's the phone number?" 410-473-7249. Lucky wrote the numbers down on a pad of motel stationery. "Remember the offer we made earlier? It's still good." He could still be free. Lucky hung up and deciphered the numbers he'd written. The first 3 digits were an area code used throughout Maryland. The remaining were a numerical code indicating the town where Melissa and Jake were. ISFRAHW. He reversed it. WHARFSI, Wharfside. The phone call had dried Lucky's tears, but that grief was still inside him, aching, as if his ribs were a cage a wild animal had thrown itself against. There was no other way out. Nothing Heather had been able to advise, although Lucky very much wanted to seek counsel with her again and wondered if there was a way that was possible. He doubted it. Besides, he didn't think his new therapist would agree with his plans. Kill Jake and Melissa to free himself from the Winterses. Murder William McKenna to save his family. Slaughter everyone standing in the way of his happiness. Chapter 12. Jake. Harold sat against the boat, balefully glaring at Jake. "Have you been shot before?" Jake asked. "Can't say I have." "You're handling it really well." Jake glanced at Harold's bare leg, the pants leg cut away. His leg was surprisingly small and thin and starkly white, like wispy smoke. Jake lifted his camera, the strap around his neck and under his arm, aimed it at Harold's thigh. The torn skin resembled brittle fall leaves, the dried blood a burnt auburn. "What do you take all those pictures for anyway?" Harold asked. "Who sees them?" "Nobody, yet." "You think someone's going to want to see my hurt leg someday?" "It's not your leg." Jake lifted the camera, gazed through the viewfinder. "It's something else." "Son, it's still a bullet wound," he heard Harold say. "No matter how you look at it." "I meant it's not just that." Jake lowered himself to his elbows, looked past the wounded flesh in front of him, the edges like torn pages. Jake snapped the photograph, examined it in the Lumix's display. He thought about showing it to Harold, but doubted the older man would care. Subjects never responded the way he wanted. Instead, they often criticized Jake's photos, asked for a retake or a different angle, as if they thought the image belonged to them. "You worried about Melissa?" Harold asked. Jake looked up from the camera guiltily. He'd been staring so intently at the photo that he'd momentarily forgotten Melissa had left. "No offense," Harold went on, "but I don't think you're the kind of man to keep her safe. You barely took me down, and I'm not exactly Charles Atlas." "I don't know who that is." "Just can't see how you'll protect her." Harold's words hung in the air. Jake rose, picked up the gun from the floor. He didn't like holding the weapon, its heaviness, or the way he felt that at any moment the gun might fire. He hated violence. How it permeated every instance of culture, seemed destined to affect every American. Jake knew the notion sounded hopelessly naive, but he often wondered if a peaceful country was even possible.
This is the end of disc number 3. Please insert disc number 4.